Okay, this is Sociology, lesson number 3. It's on society and culture, and this is the second part of it. We last time we defined what a society is. We said a society is a group of people who live in a certain territory, are subject to common political authority, they have a common identity or culture, and there's established patterns of social interactions. And then we said, interactions are important in sociology. In fact, the definition of sociology is it's the study of human social interaction on different scales, macro, meso, micro. And so to integrate this with what we know already, you can say that these social interactions we can go back to and look at social forces, right? These social forces are social interactions. So this is you, right? And your reality, which is your cognitive reality, and you interact with each of these. You can interact with the government, media, entertainment industry, marketing, commercials, social media, social reality, culture, education, family and friends you interact with, physical world, obviously you interact with. You can interact with the economy and God and religion, right? So just as a quick review to hopefully refresh things in your mind, I gave you examples already of how the government can be a social force, right? I gave you 3 examples in which the government manipulated the population into wars, all right? The Iraq invasion war, the Gulf of Tonkin incident for Vietnam, and Pearl Harbor for World War II, right? And so the government can also work through the media. So the government, for example, can leak information to the media, can release time the release of statements to the media. It can get on the news programs. It's like the Sunday news programs, so forth, right? Nightline or whatever. It can leak information to the media. It can release time release of intelligence reports, so forth, right? Now the media influences your perceptions. They can control what you perceive by controlling the information you're exposed to. They decide which stories to tell you and what stories not to tell you, which can have a big impact on the way you see the world. And when they tell you a story, they decide what information to tell you and what information not to tell you, right? And these go a long way in shaping your realities. Certain news outlets, for example, Fox, are highly distorted and biased, and they can spin things greatly, and they do. There's actually there used to be a segment in there called the No Spin Zone, and I would just laugh at that because I'm thinking it's like the total spin zone, like the gyroscope, high speed spin zone. Okay, so entertainment industry. The entertainment industry can plant popular notions, trends. They can impact trends, personas, past personas. For example, who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Um, they can create and plant in mind expected scenarios, or they can plant images, and thus influence the way you see things. Entertainment industry can also help commerce. For example, there's a lot of movies which have products, Pepsi or Coke or this or that, Atari or whatever, basically advertising within movies. Now, marketing is pretty pervasive in our society. Marketing is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry, and the reason why is because it works. It influences behavior. It influences consumption patterns, purchasing patterns, branding, whatever, product loyalty, and so forth. Another one is social media. Social media is fairly new. It's fairly novel. And the impact of it, the influence of it, is based largely upon the fact that it's interactive, that you engage in it, right? When you're actively interacting with it, it is more relevant. It draws your attention and focus and interest. And another thing is it's on demand, right? It's at your fingertips. It's on your smartphone. It's on your laptop or desktop computer. And social media goes a long way creating something called social reality, which is what everyone's saying, right? It's a dominant thing that everyone's saying, and yet it needs to have no reality whatsoever in it. So social reality dominates perceptions, and it can be based on nothing. Why does it dominate? Why nothing? Well, no one remembers the facts, right? Remember half the facts? Remember 25% of the facts? 10%? How about zero facts? They're going to remember absolutely zero of the facts. Remember zero of the intelligent analysis. And what's going to dominate is what everyone's saying about it, which has nothing to do with the facts. And social reality, for all the reasons I explained, and I can't go through them all over again, but social reality is the most dominant reality. It's most salient. It's super salient. Plus, social reality is easy to control, like starting a wave, a stadium wave, right? And it is kind of like a wave of people saying this, and it's taken to be true. Everyone's saying it, so that's true. It doesn't matter how educated you are, people fall for it. It's almost like some social psychological glitch. So this is the dominant reality. Not facts, intelligent analysis, gone. This is oblivious. They're oblivious to this, and this is what they see in their head. This dominates. All right, culture. We'll talk about culture in the next section, how culture impacts the way we see things. Very powerful influence. Education. Education hopefully for the better, but not always. Some of the stuff we learn in school, for example, popular histories, is rather bunk. Family and friends influence you. To the extent it depends upon how closely knit you are. Physical world obviously infects you. If you run over by a car crossing the street, well, the physical world will affect you. Technology will affect you, right? In numerous ways. It'll affect your jobs, it'll affect your leisure, affect what you can do, how you communicate, interact with other people, and get information. Like I said, it affects your jobs here. Healthcare is huge, right? We'll talk about healthcare in the 12th lesson. The economy can affect you and your jobs, right? Big factor in affecting your jobs is bosses, coworkers, but also technology. For example, advancing technology may antiquate some jobs. Some jobs go out, right? They're replaced by automation, or a big thing coming up is artificial intelligence. It's going to have, I think, a huge impact on the job market. Government can affect jobs, can affect the economy, and can affect jobs through trade relations, right? For better or worse, and not in simplistic ways, which too often our political leaders fall for. Okay, now each of these are social forces because they can influence the way you perceive things, and if they influence the way you see the world, right, they can affect your actions or inaction, and if they can do it on a large scale, it affects collective action, which gives them power. All right, we talked about that. And so what I want to do next is give some examples of social interactions. We said here's some types: communication, cooperation, exchange relationships. We'll talk about this in the next lesson. Competition, we'll talk about this more when we talk about a quick view of market analysis. Opposition, free speech is the key. The key purpose of free speech is to give political opposition a voice. Obedience, it's not to say whatever crap you want. Obedience, disobedience, support, dependence, interdependence. We talked about interdependence. We talked about Durkheim and functionalism. We talked about specialization, division of labor, comparative advantage, so forth, right? And interdependence. Independence. Independent thinkers, for example. Most people think they're independent thinkers because it is true that everyone has the ability to decide what they want to believe and what they don't want to believe. They can totally think whatever they want, and that's that's what people do. Typically, they believe what they want to believe. Um, but are they really independent thinkers, or are they influenced? And to what extent are they influenced, not without even knowing it? Are they original thinkers? Very few are really original thinkers that think outside the box, right? Most people just follow the beaten path. Influence. So another type of social interaction is influence, and I highlight that as being important. It is important. As in studying sociology, you're studying social human interactions. It's important to know how people can influence other people, right? Because that gives you power. This is influence. All this is influence, right? And we'll speak more towards influence in the later lessons, including this one, right? And you can divide types of influence into two general categories: internal versus external. Internal influence involves altering perceptions, beliefs, values, right? External influence is forced, right? Involves arm twisting, leverage, laws, even torture, economic sanctions, whatever, okay? And the question is, which of these is more effective, right? A lot of people think, oh, force them, that's more effective. Well, no, it's not, right? Far more effective is internal influence. If you can get people on your side, motivated to want to get what you want, right, it's far more effective. People will go all out. I told you the example of, for example, Pearl Harbor, right? How from day one, the start of the war, to the last day of the war, Americans were fighting like mad dogs. Why? Because of Pearl Harbor, right? If you force people, you can get resistance, you can get minimal effort, you can get opposition, you can get sabotage and so forth, right? You can get, worst case is civil war. So the idea here is both of these are used to control behavior, and if you can control behavior, that gives you power. All right, so now, a key method of internal influence is through the study of signs, and that's semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs. I say it's a key method of influence via symbolic interaction, right? You control symbols. Now, I've had students say, right off the bat, say, oh, that's crazy, that's far-fetched, you can't do that. That's like subliminal advertising. You can't fool me. All right, I'll show you. It's a lot easier and real to do, right? Again, how much this information will be retained is questionable, but so semiotics is the study of signs. A sign is a symbol, and we said that a symbol is anything that stands for something else. All right. I gave you the example of a dog. I gave you the triangle. It's a fundamental thing in semiotics. You have the actual object, a dog, right? You have the word dog, then you have the meaning for that, and each of these can be different, right? And what's key, though, is the meaning, right? The meaning is important because that's what gets into our heads. All right. Okay, so we said that a sign can be a street sign, a gang sign, language, words, body language, powerful image, powerful images, an idea, an international incident. We talked about several of those. An attack, right? Anything passed through the media, right? Leaks, government leaks, intelligence reports, right? Stuff like that. Signs are used to convey meaning into our heads, thereby influence and in fact control perceptions, which is the only reality we know. So our cognitive reality is the only reality we know, because that's where knowing is, in our heads, right? We all think we know reality, but we know just what we know. That then determines human actions. Umberto Eco said that semiotics is a study of lies. So semiotics officially is a study of signs, but he says it's a study of lies, because anything that can be used to tell the truth can be used to tell a lie, to create a false perception. So if you really study semiotics, you can learn how to structure things to create false perceptions, to create false realities, which is a lie. And what do we say? In the big picture, lies are all of the devil, right? You want to stay away from these, right? Although people tend to lie quite often, all the time in little ways. Umberto Eco said, well, he wrote the screenplay for a play called The Name of the Rose, and they made a movie out of this. It stars Sean Connery and Christian Slater, right? Uh, just the phrase here, which is based upon Shakespeare, Rose by any other name, right? But it's based upon deeper understanding. I'm not going to get into that because, when you address literature, which has subjective meaning in it, right, based upon your knowledge background, right, it's too easy to attack. So I'm not going to bother with that. But this has deeper meaning, right, and it has to do with signs. Can the government, media, entertainment industry plant signs, signals, images in your head, like incidents, histories, ideas, notions in our head, right? And a fundamental method of lying is planting trees, right? So then we talked about Trojan horses. What a Trojan horse is, it's sneaking things into our heads, not sneaking things into a fort, right? And then another name for Trojan horses are trees, which are anything that are intentionally planted in mind to alter the landscape, the way we see things, the view in our heads, right? And I said, in order for trees to be effective, they have to be planted with salience, right? We went through salience factors, like it's got to be recency, which involves timing. There has to be emotions, strong emotions attached to it. If it's ego-pleasing, right? This is powerful because we're driven to satisfy self. People are inherently self-serving. We talked about self-serving bias when we talked about the Klee-Kandinsky experiment, right? How extreme, and baseless people's perceptions were based upon self-serving bias, self-interest, repetition, social reinforcement, is powerful. Sequencing trees we talked about here. You can steer them all the way around. I showed you, for example, how praying would distort facts, attack facts, the significance of facts, right? Isolate them and try to dismiss them. Short, simple, easy to remember is better, right? A simple joke is huge, right? Complex facts, detailed facts, people are not going to remember. Okay, now social reality is huge as far as salience. Now, I mentioned that when I was doing my research, and it was basically my original thesis was how nations manipulate populations into wars, and a big part of that was how perceptions are manipulated, and a big part of that was tree planting, and part of that was types of trees, and I identified 47 categories of trees, right? Two of which I'll present here just briefly. I have to compress things for the sake of time. One is detonators, and the other is histories, right? We'll talk about histories here real briefly, right? But I want to go with the detonators. Now, let's examine what a detonator is. Oh, wait a minute. This is not... wow, these are all out of order. Okay. Okay, there it is. So, here's a detonator. Here's an explosive. So the big explosive, this is C4. It looks like a fairly large block, but that could be deceptive. But I think it's a fairly large block, maybe even like up to 10 pounds. If it's 10 pounds of C4, that is a lot of explosives, right? Now, this represents a war, a big explosion, a big effect upon the world. To get it started, to get this to blow, you need a detonator. C4 is relatively inert. It's fairly safe. I mean, you can hit it with a sledgehammer, it's not going to blow, right? You can pound it, right? You can light it on fire, it won't blow, it'll just burn, like wood, basically, To get it to blow, you need a detonator. It's a smaller explosive, yet it can be powerful. right? So these detonators that used to be made out of mercury fulminate, which was very powerful. If this is the size of a firecracker, this thing could be like 20, 30 times more powerful than a firecracker. These are powerful, but it gets these to blow. So a detonator is an incident that is manufactured to start a war, right? And that's planted in mind, right? So they see the detonator, right? And it's planted in mind, right? So that you get the population to support and justify the war, to influence them internally, right? Have them go all out in support of the war. Okay, so yeah, I've given you examples of detonators already. We'll go back to lesson 1. And I cannot teach you all this. I'm willing to bet that very little, if nothing, is remembered. No specific facts remembered about the method in which the Bush administration manipulated the population and the Congress into the Iraq invasion war, right? But I taught you all these things. You know, it's all a blur now, I'm sure, in your heads. Right, all the fear signals, you know, fear mongering, you know, and I showed you how it was, you know, clearly timed, right? There's human hand involved, not random, right? And how we're inundated with all these Bush fear speeches and time release of intelligence reports and so forth, right? I can't go through it all again. Reactivate all that information in your head, which will be forgotten anyways. Then I gave you the example of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, how the Gulf of Tonkin incident was used to manipulate the Congress into signing off on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which became the legal basis for the Vietnam War, just like the Iraq War resolution became the legal basis for that war, justifying troop movements, justifying appropriation bills, and all that stuff. Okay, yeah, so I can't teach all this again. All right, maybe I'll touch a little bit upon them when we get to it, but all this I cannot teach again. So what I'm saying, the reason why I'm saying this is because I know that, you know, it's all faded, it's all gone, and then it's no longer believable. But maybe you remember that once I made it understandable. All right, then I gave the example of Pearl Harbor, how that was used to manufacture our involvement in World War II. And, you know, like I said, in this case, I think this was our good war. This is our moral war. And I think, you know, what was done was, in this case, was justified, right? But just because it is in this case doesn't mean it is in the vast majority of cases in our wars, although we like to think so. You know, people are patriotic and country-loving because it's their country, and, you know, ultimately it's because they're self-loving. Deep down, that's a driving force, right? It's not about truth. It's not about morality. You know, they'll twist things to make it moral so that they can believe that. All right, so this is Pearl Harbor. I can't teach you all this again. All right, maybe just going through this will spark a memory here and there. Yeah, I mentioned praying and how you can manipulate history to manufacture lies. All right. Okay, so let's get to detonators. These are the detonators I want to cover, and what I'll do is I'll start with a review. So to put this in its proper context, we talked about social forces. Social forces are forces because they have impact, influence. And one way they influence is through communication. And communication is always through transmitting a signals, symbols, signs, right? Those symbols are signs. The study of signs is semiotics, right? Which is also the study of lies, right? One method is planting things in mind. We talked about how you can do that with Trojan horses, right? Trees, which is another term for a synonymous term for Trojan horses, right? They alter the way you see things in your view. And one of the types of trees are detonators, right? And then there's also a whole slew of tree planting methods, which I'm not going to get into. I'm not going to touch upon at all. I don't have time for that. So I've shown you, proven to you, 3 examples of U.S. detonators already, right? And I'm willing to bet that, little to no facts are remembered. All right. So as a caveat, leading into this, I cannot give a full-blown historical review of each of these for the sake that I'm trying to squeeze this all into roughly an hour, right? And teaching in the class, I'd squeeze it into about an hour. With desktop videos, I can, meander a little bit, take my time, go a little bit longer. But I still got to compress things, right? I can only teach you the basics in a short lesson, but even then, people will remember literally 0, But, there's going to be a strong tendency to want to disbelieve, especially when it comes to U.S. detonators. Sure, people believe that Japan did it, Germany did it, right? But when it comes to U.S. doing it, no, U.S. didn't do it, right? But what I say here is look it up or shut up, right? A lot of people will not look it up. They won't remember any facts, and they won't look it up. They'll just believe what based on whatever. And oftentimes it's based upon social reality. If you get a social reality shift, well, that's good enough. Don't just go to social reality. Why? Because people are both ignorant and self-serving liars. It's just the way it is. People will lie, right? Again, it's not about honesty. It's not about truth. It's not about anything concerning justice. It's about what makes you feel good. All right. So we'll talk about the first one. The first one is Japan invasion of Manchuria. They manufactured a detonator to justify that war. When they invaded China in 1937, they manufactured another one, an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge. Germany, to invade Poland, manufactured an incident at a border town called Gleiwitz, right? And U.S. Iraq invasion, this was more, well, it was a carefully choreographed blitz of fear signals, right? Weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Time with 9/11, right? To associate that with 9/11, to use all that fear. Then there was a bait and switch where they flipped it all on Iraq, right? And 70% of the American people believe Iraq did 9/11. There was time release of intelligence reports, timed arrest of terror cells, timed statements in the press, a blitz of fear signals in the press. Then a timed, push for the resolution, saying, with all this threat, this fear that, to keep us safe, we need this resolution. And they then manipulated the vote of the resolution. They timed that to be right before the congressional recess, where then the congressman would go home for the last-ditch effort to get elected, right? Last 3 weeks before the November, first Tuesday in November election, right? And, all right. Yeah, maybe that helped. I know when you give a brief overview like this, you leave out all the detailed facts, and then this becomes a reality, and then this can be more vulnerable. U.S. Gulf War. So the first Gulf War, we'll talk about this more, and I think this will be the thing that people will attack, right? They'll try to shift all focus to this, right? So I'll hold off on this until I'll add a little more. But I'll teach more of this when we get to U.S. involvement in the Middle East, the history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and it'll make more sense once we get there. What's going on? All right. U.S. Vietnam, I told you that, how they wanted a dramatic event, and how for example, McCone said, we can get a resolution if we attack them, and when they respond to our attack, then we take that resolution, before Congress. They played a multiple cognitive framework game. I can't explain that all again. Planned sequence of attack signals, right? There was a 30-day plan, right? they did far more than the 30-day plan, but they did almost every element in the 30-day plan, right? They left out things like, I know they left out recall independence, right? They didn't do that, even though that was on the plan. As far as I know, they didn't do that. Yeah, I didn't find that. Plant multiple reinforcing trees, then we had actual attacks. So then we started attacking them, and, then we sent the ship right where we attacked, right, and that created an incident. World War II, Japan, the whole thing with oil, we knew oil would bring a war. We knew that since 1939, or at least FDR knew that since 1939, that there would be Japan would have to attack. All right. Well, how much do I want to say here? I guess I don't want to say too much here. Maybe I'll review this more and we'll get into it. World War I, Germany, there were two key detonators. One was the sinking of Lusitania, right? And the other was the German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare against United States ships. They declared that February 1st of 1917, and then they started sinking some of our ships. I think they sank about 4 of our ships before, Wilson then, got pushed for Congress to get a declaration of war, and we went to war with them. And USS Spain, right? So sinking ships here. Pearl Harbor, remember Pearl Harbor, right? Dramatic event. Gulf of Tonkin here. Remember the Maine with Spain, blew up in Havana Harbor, and the phrase was, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," right? U.S.-American Indian Wars. I'm going to give you the example of Custer's Last Stand, right, which is a heroic, effort against, vicious, wild Indians, and it helped justify war against the Sioux and Cheyenne, which we took away the Black Hills of South Dakota from them. U.S. war against Mexico. All right. We again, an incident was manufactured at Matramos. Right. Texas. This is how we got the whole Southwest territory of the United States. Texas against Mexico. The phrases were "Remember the Alamo" or "Remember Goliad," right? Where these were massacres by General Santa Anna. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. The first one I want to cover is Japan's manufactured incident to justify their invasion of Manchuria. So here's Japan here. This is Manchuria, the northern, I guess you could say, that prominence of China, sticking up there. And the basic background is, for a couple hundred years, Europeans started colonizing the territory in Asia, especially in the 19th century. That accelerated, and there's being gobbled up. Philippines were gobbled up by Spain. Indochina was gobbled up by France. Malaysia by Britain. Right? Britain had India. Indonesia, the Indies here were Dutch. All right. Australia was British. Okay, now Japan felt threatened. Japan was really the only one to really hold out. All right, invasion, and they're threatened. For example, we had Commodore Perry going over there, and what was that? When was that? Like 1848 or something like that. Commodore Perry went over to Japan. The force open doors, the open door policy there with Japan, and Japan, they could feel the pressure, the threat of European conquest and control, colonization. So what they did in 1868 is they had something called the Meiji Restoration, where they restored basically the Japanese monarchy, to this, their government was more or less like a feudalistic government with the top dog, warlord being the shogun, and so they kicked them out and they westernized. In fact, they outlawed samurai as a class for the Meiji Restoration, and they figured this: that hey, if we're going to stop the Europeans from coming in and conquering us, we got to be just like them. We got to be just as westernized as them. So they tried to revamp their whole society, right? One was politics here. We said we restored the emperor. They restored the emperor, they restored the monarchy, and they basically took on a British democratic monarchy system, right? In which you had a king, there was the emperor as kind of like more or less like a figurehead, but the emperor did have some influence and power. And then you had a parliament similar to the British parliamentary system. All right, in economics, they adopted American economics, market economics, and American industrial practices. Army, they're heavily influenced by the Prussian land forces, right? And Navy, they were influenced by French at first, and then Britain. By the end of they purchased initially a lot of French ships, warships, and then by the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century, they purchased largely British ships. Education, they took on a German education system, which what was it now? They had Realschulen, and basically they had two tracks. You go through the traditional general education track, leading towards more advanced education, college, post-secondary stuff, or you go into like a vocational system, which split off about middle school age. So you're tracked early, whether you're going to go on to college or go through some vocational type of training. All right, that's pretty much kind of like the German system. So they did that in 1868. Now, in industrializing, improving, manufacturing, and increasing their exports, generating more revenues, and that's supporting a larger population. Their population grew, and by 1900, their population had grown to the point where they could not produce enough food to feed all their people. So they became net importers of food by 1900. All right, and that situation only got worse. Japanese are industrious, productive people, hardworking, and so by 1929, they're even more dependent upon food imports. But what happened in 1929, as most people know, the Great Depression hit. And a key response to the Great Depression was a U.S. response in which we threw up protectionist barriers. The big one was that Smoot-Hawley tariff, like 60 to 65% tariff, whopping tariff. And that kicked off trade wars, essentially. And other major nations responded, throwing up their own tariffs. And so it was like counter-reprisal, tariffs being thrown up, and international trade crumbled. And that drove us further into the Great Depression. There's so much inefficiency with trade wars. And so it worsened the economic conditions, but it especially made it worse for countries who were not resource rich. The United States weathered the storm okay. The Great Depression was pretty tough on the United States, right? But we could survive, based on the fact that we are a very resource-rich country. We had plenty of oil, we had plenty of agriculture, right, minerals, so forth. So we can be what's called an autarkic, AUTARTACK, I think, economy, which is totally self-independent, self-supporting. Now, Japan was not that case. They were resource poor. They couldn't produce enough food for the people, right? So in short stead, they're looking at a very bad situation. They're looking at possible starvation, or at least a lot of widespread suffering and malnutrition, and so they said, well, They said, screw it, we're gonna go invade Manchuria. Now, what should they have done? You know, they should have just sucked it up and starved, right? But they weren't going to do that, you know. And so what they did is they manufactured an incident. They blew up a section of their Southern Manchuria Railroad. Now, this is the Southern Manchuria Railroad. It's linked in a number of places. Goes to the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula, going up here, going through Manchuria, right? Also tied in, linking in Vladivostok, which we talked about, as far as Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union prior to World War II, prior to Pearl Harbor. All right, and they blew up a section of this, and from what I read, it was like a minor, small section, like a type of thing you could repair in about a day or two, right? But they used that as their detonator justification for invading Manchuria. So they went in and went in and forced Manchuria to take it over, right? Okay, so then in 1937 they went further. They wanted to go further into China, and to justify their invasion of China, they manufactured another incident on the Marco Polo Bridge, right? And they used that as justification to invade China. All right, so like we said, a detonator is an incident that is manufactured to start a war, right? It's planted in the minds of the public, right? Get them to support the war. Now, Germany in 1939 wanted to invade Poland. Prior to this, Germany had been taken back, big chunks of territory lost with the Versailles Treaty, and it was invaded Austria, invaded also Czechoslovakia, I think they Alsace-Lorraine, and then they wanted to go for Poland, right? All prior to this, it was Chamberlain was appeasing them, right? Let them get away with this, right? And then finally they said with Poland, enough is enough. We gotta draw a line in the sand somewhere. So that kicked off World War II, where the British and French, declared war in Germany for their invasion of Poland. Poland was German territory prior to the Versailles Treaty. For a couple hundred years, Poland didn't exist as a nation. It was gobbled up by the Prussian states, and then later after the Franco-Prussian War by Germany, and Russia on the other side. Okay, so to justify this invasion of Poland, they manufactured an incident called the Gleiwitz Deception, right? Also called Operation Himmler, because apparently he was the chief inspiration behind it. And what it involved is an attack upon this radio outpost, German radio outpost, almost like a forward listening post type thing, right? To see what, keep track of what's going on the border. And they had a radio station to quickly relay, information back. And they manufactured a fake attack upon this outpost. So what they did was they took German prisoners who the Germans were holding. They dressed them in German uniforms and they shot them all up, right? Put the bodies here, right? Then they had SS soldiers dressed up as Polish soldiers. This is the Polish uniforms back then. And the SS soldiers, these guys, right, dressed to look like Polish soldiers, staged a fake attack on this radio station, right? And the guy who actually is interesting side note is the guy who acquired the Polish uniforms for the Germans was Oskar Schindler. So Oskar Schindler of Schindler's List fame played a role in starting World War II. All right, so they manufactured a fake attack and they used that as justification. The next day, Hitler sent his armies to invade Poland. All right, Iraq War resolution. I gave you a lot of information. I can't explain it all again, but I'll try to summarize it real shortly here. This is 9/11/2001 when Al Qaeda, led by Bin Laden, attacked 3 places: the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and also they're probably going to attack the nation's capital. And on that day, day one, on that day, the Defense Department, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz are trying to use the attack by Al Qaeda to justify an attack upon Iraq. And the next day, Bush is on board with that. So you get the big attack here, and each time you see P, that stands for plans. This is when General Wesley Clark found out that we have a plan to attack Iraq, right? Even though there was no linkage between Iraq and 9/11. And this is when he found out further that not only do we have a plan to attack Iraq, we have a plan to take down the governments of 7 nations in 5 years, right? Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, and I believe it was Lebanon, right? So take down 7 nations. Now, this is kind of key because those were Soviet client states, right? And ex-Soviet client states, Russian client states, right? So this has bigger consequences. This is putting pressure on Russia. This is encroaching upon their sphere of influence, right? And that's a bigger picture of things going on. I'm not going to get into that now, but just kind of keep that in mind. Now, so the plan was to do a bait and switch, all the fear and terror created by the attack by Al Qaeda, flip it onto Iraq, and then build it up even further with the fear of, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, right? All of which were lies, right? And they've had a big blitz timed with 9/11, kicked off with 9/11, and they've even bragged they had a plan to do this, right? They said they had a meticulously planned strategy to convince the public and the Congress and allies to take action against Iraq and Saddam Hussein, right? And it's going to make it difficult for anyone to vote against the resolution. How is it difficult? Well, in the midst of this big fear campaign, they're hyping up great fear here, right? They put the resolution vote here, and they say the resolution is going to keep us safe amidst this fear, right? And they time this before the congressional recess, right, which is the last stretch right before the election. If you vote against this, in this fear environment, if you vote against this resolution, not only are you unpatriotic, right? Not only do you not care about the safety of the American public, you're a terrorist lover, or you're an irresponsible left-wing extremist kook, right? And you just commit political suicide. And it was effective at I think it was what paper was it that said, I think it was the New York Times said, converting dovish Democrats into hawks. All right, gaining more votes, right? And then once you got that resolution, it authorized the president to use military force, which meant the war, right? Euphemism for war. Euphemistic wording, lawyer language for war. Okay. Now, I want to just briefly introduce the first Gulf War. I know that I'm not going to give much information here, so if there's a point where people will attack, it'll be probably here, right? And I'll try to shift all focus onto this because it's more vulnerable, and that's a method that's typically used, right? And then try to use this attack to capture the total focus of a popular mind, and then use that to discredit everything which people don't remember anything about the rest of no facts to be remembered. So let's try to manufacture an attack here. But I wrote the strategy for the first Gulf War, and I was a true believer back then. It wasn't too much later that I realized that, man, what was it? It's like mid-90s. So the first Gulf War occurred. It started in 1990, but the actual war was 1991. Well, we started the bombing campaign in January, and it lasted about 6. By the end of January, we're starting it, and it lasted about 6 weeks, and then they had the ground offensive, 4-day war. The brilliant victory, 4 days. That was about mid-March when that happened, right? But all this started in about July, August of 1990, right? When Saddam moved in. Well, here's a little bit of background. Okay, so Iran and Iraq fought a long war, right, lasting from 1980 to about 88, and a lot of casualties. Well over 1 million Iranians killed. I think there were less Iraqis, but still in the hundreds of thousands. Very costly war. And at the same time, well, this war was on the surface superficially based upon a border dispute along the Shat al-Arab waterway, right? But I believe it's more than that. I mean, Saddam gave several rationalizations, justifications for invading Iran, all right? I think much of which were bogus, including the Shat al-Arab waterway. I think what he really wanted was to grab this province down here. This is a huge chunk of Iranian oil reserves. It's called I think it's Khuzestan province down here, all right? Big chunk. And their export facilities are right along the Shat al-Arab waterway, right about there. Basra, up there, further up, is a big oil exporting port facilities for Iraq, right? But it goes through the Shat al-Arab waterway. So if you control the Shat al-Arab waterway, you can shut down their exports, right? But I think really what Saddam wanted was he wanted to grab this chunk of oil reserves, and if he did, he'd become the major player in the Middle East, right? He would essentially double his oil production capacity, right? Giving him plenty of excess capacity to both, run his economy, right, and to decrease production. So he'd have plenty of spare production capacity. He can shut down production, all right. That would drive up oil prices, and that would increase his revenues. And at the same time, with all the extra oil he's selling, plus at a higher price, he's making far more revenues. And with that, he can purchase more weapons, to bolster his military position, right? And he'd become the dominant player in the Middle East. And that would further disrupt the balance of power and further threaten oil flow out of that region. It was bad strategically all around to let him do this, right? He couldn't allow him to do that. Disputed border. Okay, so at the same time, there's a disputed border between, not only was it a disputed border here along the Shat al-Arab waterway, there's this disputed border between Iraq up here and Kuwait, right? And during this war, when Iraq is busy, fighting Iran, Kuwaitis occupied 700 acres of disputed territory. I mean, 700 acres isn't that large, but it could still be very wealthy as far as oil reserves there. Now, the U.S. encouraged Kuwait to use oil as leverage. We'll see a document later which attests to that. The leverage they used was to overproduce oil beyond their OPEC quota, driving down price, right? And so driving down price, Kuwait would benefit by selling more oil, increasing the volume of oil sales, right? Even though price is going down, right? But that would hurt Iraq, right? With price going down, right? That's a reduction in revenues for Iraq, who was deeply in debt, right? And Saddam saw that as theft out of his pocket, so to speak. So he warned Kuwait in June and July 3 times, right, with military threat. Then he puts, I think, what day was it? Like July 26th or something like that, somewhere around there. He puts 100,000 troops on the border, right? That's 10 army divisions, right? All the tanks, artillery, whatnot, trucks, and armored personnel carriers, and the very next day or the day after, I have all this in my notes in the next lesson. The spokesman for the State Department gives, what I want to say, like an unprovoked, just just offers without any request, a statement, you know. So Iraq threatens Kuwait 3 times. Saddam threatens Kuwait 3 times with military attack, right? Then he put 100,000 troops on the border, 10 army divisions, right? And then right after that, the State Department spokesperson says, the U.S. has no defense treaty with Kuwait, nor do we have any defense or security commitment to Kuwait. I mean, that's like insane, given that situation. And it's the exact opposite of what you should do, right? And that was followed by 2 more green lights. I guess I'll come back to those green lights, but let me explain the situation here. So let's say if this is a scale of what we should have done, the best possible thing we should have done, and this is the scale of the worst possible thing, the extreme opposite. Well, we did this. We didn't do this. We didn't do anywhere in between. We did the extreme opposite, all right? So the extreme high end of the scale would be like something that President Eisenhower did in the 1950s when China threatened the islands of Quemoy and Matsu here, right? And I haven't really studied this incident in great detail, right, at all. I just read briefly about it, right? But my feeling is this, just my overall feeling. The reason why this was important to Eisenhower was, well, here's Taiwan. Taiwan is not recognized by Communist China, and they want to take it over, right? And this is the democratic Chinese here, right? So taking Quemoy and Matsu Islands kind of represented testing the waters, dipping your toe in the tub to see what response you're going to get, right? And seeing what they can get away with, in a sense. That's kind of how I think Eisenhower probably assessed this. So he reacted, strongly. He said, "Listen, you take those islands, we're going to nuke you," right? And by today's standards, they may seem unreasonable because chances are, you're not going to throw nukes for that, right? And that's why I guess Kennedy came up with an alteration of policy called flexible response to be more realistic. But that was Eisenhower back then. He said, "Listen, don't even think about it, right? Our reaction is going to be swift and extreme." And that's the way you prevent conflict. You leave nothing equivocal, nothing, no guesswork here. And so that's what we should have done, right? I mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, the big stick policy, right? You make it totally unequivocal, no question, right? You leave no uncertainty. Our response is going to be swift, and it's going to be severe. It'll be extreme, right? But you don't want to do this in a way that is provoking or escalating, or you corner yourself or your adversary into necessitating conflict, right? In a way that would increase the probability of conflict, right? You want to reduce the possibility of conflict by leaving no question as to our response. All right, so that's what we should have done. Well, we did the exact opposite. We gave 3 green light signals. So, again, 3 warnings to attack Kuwait. Then you put 100,000 troops on the border. And then right away you say, we have no defense. Why do you say that? Why do you offer that? No defense treaty with Kuwait, nor do we have any defense or security commitment to Kuwait. That's crazy, all right? You're trying to sucker Saddam into attacking. Okay, so then the very next day, Saddam hears this, right? So he calls in April Glaspie, who is the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, calls him into the office in Baghdad or whatever, right? And she says, in regards to Arab border disputes, the U.S. has no opinion. In fact, our Secretary of State, James Baker, has instructed our State Department spokesperson to say so. And sure enough, she did the day before, right? And then at a congressional hearing a few days later, Assistant Secretary of State Kelly, being questioned by Congressman Hamilton from Indiana, Lee Hamilton from Indiana, said exactly the same thing as Margaret Tutwiler. The U.S. basically has no defense treaty with Kuwait, nor do we have any defense security commitment to Kuwait, right? And that conversation went something like this. I have the exact words in my next lesson. Kind of went something like this. So Hamilton says, so you mean to tell me that if Iraq raced across the border and took as much of Kuwait as they wanted, we have no obligation to do absolutely anything? And then Kelly said, that is correct. That is correct, is it not? Hamilton responds, and then Kelly says, that is correct, sir. Right? We have no obligation to do anything. Right? So 3 green light signals. All right, now we'll learn in the next lesson how that war was key to destroying OPEC unity for nearly a decade. For 9 years, OPEC was flat on its back. Right? I'll explain that. I know right now you'd be like, what? No, that's, come on. Right? No, it worked. Right? And it's more than that. There's war can be very profitable in numerous ways, a number of ways. Not just in oil, right? Not just in weapons production, sales, so forth, right? It's beneficial economically in the broader picture, and especially to people who are in a position to get defense contracts. LOGCAP, logistical civilian augmentation program contracts, like Halliburton, for example, or private military security contractor contracts, like KBR or Blackwater. All right. Okay, so this kind of reminds me of when FDR silent, when the Japanese threatened to threaten war with us on May 31st of 1941, right? FDR should not have remained silent, right? But of course, this is a different situation. This is the situation in which they want to keep it silent so that the American public would not, put 2 and 2 together, connecting us cutting off oil with the Japanese attacking us, which would undermine, the attack as justification for war. All right, so here is the Gulf of Tonkin. Briefly review this one, right? Remember this threat signals that they May 21st of 1964 at a National Security Council meeting. George Bundy asked the group, right? This is the National Security Council. National Security Council is the president, vice president, Department of Secretary of Defense, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the chiefs, each branch, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, so forth, right? National Security advisors and Secretary of State and assistants, key assistants like McGeorge Bundy. Right? He asked if we could send threat signals, like the threat signals sent before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which fomented that. And a couple days later, he comes out with a 30-day plan, which is a bunch of threat signals, timed, right, to kick off in mid-June. And sure enough, we start concerted effort to send a big batch of threat signals here, tightly packed together, threat signals here. We started dropping commandos into North Vietnam, announcing that here. Then we started attacks on attacks on the islands just off of North Vietnam, and also air attacks. So I think I have a diagram of this. Yeah. All right. So yeah, this is manufactured. Here's the 2 maps from Navy, U.S. Navy official Blue Jackets book on naval operations during the Vietnam War, and those attacks occurred on just after midnight, July 31st, at Han May, or Han May's up here, Han New Island's down here, right? Han May had a torpedo boat base, but they sent torpedo boats to bombard those islands. Han May was hit with over 750 rounds of cannon fire. Shortly after that, 8 hours after that, U.S. ship, the USS Maddox, started a totally independent operation called a DeSoto mission, in which they're to take, action provocative enough to try to induce the shore batteries, both gun and missiles, along North Vietnam's coast, to light them up with their gunfire control radars, their missile control radars, which is the higher frequency radars, and then as opposed to lower frequency search radars, and then to then record those signals and take it so they can send them back to the U.S., whatever, Sperry Rand or Raytheon or one of those companies, and develop some sort of equipment to jam their signals next time they let them up. Right? So it's meant to be malprovocative. They were interfering with, shipping, sampans and fishing boats and crap, right? But as they're coming along here, they started intercepting signals that the North Vietnamese saw them as a threat, right? We just bombed the hell out of the nation. Oh, also, as we're going up, we attacked, air attacks at Nam Cam, and also attacks right close to in Vietnam, but close to the ocean border, right? So there's air attacks, and they sent out torpedo. Commander Herrick retreated, because of the intercepted threats, right? They were intercepting North Vietnamese communication where they see this ship as a threat and they're threatening to attack, right? So he hauls back out. He calls for orders. He's ordered back to Han Mei, right? As he's approaching Han Mei, 3 torpedo boats came out attacking, right? And that was the first incident, right? They escaped out of there. Second incident occurred only 5 hours later, right? They're ordered back in. Now it's 2 ships, the Maddox here, same ship here, with the Turner Joy, and they're supposed to complete the mission, these points, Oscar, November, Mike, and Lima, right? But instead of, they kind of skirted far away, but they approached Han Mei again, real close, right? And then they retreated away, and when they were about here, there was another boat attack at Vinh Son, and then they went back over here. Anyways, the idea is this attack never occurred, right? It was people too jacked up on adrenaline, and it was a combination of that with high sea states and phantom targets on the radar, probably just waves, right? And there was a report of high-pitched prop noises, which can occur. They sound like torpedo blades, which can occur when your own ship's propeller blades comes high out of the shallow in the water, due to rough sea states, which happened that night. A storm blew in. Anyways, Admiral Stockdale, who led the air attack, said there's nothing out there but black water and U.S. firepower. There's no damn ships out there, right? Commander Herrick by midnight is saying that there was no attack. This appears doubtful. Nonetheless, next day on the 5th, that's the same day, I guess, August 5th. Yeah, that's the same day they got out of there. Johnson orders bombing of North Vietnam, and then we get the congressional resolution signed off on August 7th, right? 100% of congressmen, just like amazing that 100% of congressmen all voted for this, and all but 2 senators voted for this. So they got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorized the president to use military force, which is carte blanche, their hot little ticket to war. So this is the legal basis for the war, right? How they can, put troops on the ground, large-scale conventional forces on the ground, call up a draft, right? All the military appropriation bills to finance a very costly war. All right, it's all legally justified by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So that was that. All right, Pearl Harbor attack. I'll just touch briefly upon these. So, as you recall, I made this diagram of the Pearl Harbor attack because I know that people are not going to keep all the facts in their head. In fact, they'll remember basically nothing, right? So you have to draw a picture to have it all in front of your face so that you can have a better chance of correlating and integrating all this information, and synthesizing it to see the big picture here. You have to make a picture. But at the same time, this makes it bare bones. All the richness of the facts are left out, but, you got to sacrifice. So we'll start here. So we knew that if we cut off oil, Japan's going to have to attack, right? We knew this. FDR knew this since October 1939. This is the meeting Ambassador Grew, who was ambassador to Japan, had in Washington with FDR. Said he met with him twice. And he said, you know, if we cut off oil to Japan, Japan feels like its strategic needs are not being met, right? Then they're going to go and take the Dutch East Indies, right? And then Roosevelt kind of glibly said, "Oh, then we'll jump them on the way," right? So he knows. That shows he knows, right? That Japan's going to have to make an attack to go get some oil if oil's cut off from them. May 31st, Japan. Following earlier in May, it was like May 3rd, May 26th. There's leaks in the press that we may cut off oil to Japan. Japan responds on May 31st. You cut off oil, there's going to be war. There will be war, right? FDR administration is silent on that. They say nothing about that. What do we say the response should be? Leave no question at all that our reaction is going to be swift and severe. Okay. All right. So yeah. Then in June 23rd, Ickes writes a letter to FDR saying, "Now we know our way into this war. It's through cutting off oil to Japan, which will make it not only possible but easy to get into this war in an effective way." Right. Now, it sounds like Ickes was a bad person. I've read a little bit of what Ickes wrote. He was an intelligent man, and I believe he was a decent man. I believe FDR was a decent man. They're just dealing with a bad situation. They're trying to make the best of it, you know, and it could have gotten bad. Anyways, July 17th, Admiral Turner he had been tasked to. Admiral Turner was Chief of War Plans, Navy Chief of War Plans. Big insight to the overall strategic situation, and he reports. He was tasked to do a study. He reports July 17th that we cut off oil to Japan. Yeah, we're going to war. And he says they're going to take the Dutch East Indies, but before that they'll take, you know, Thailand. They'll take the Philippines. They'll take Malaysia, right? And like I think I told you, that was a fundamental, simple strategic problem, right? It was easy to see what they had to do, right? FDR knew that, right? In that discussion, I think it was October 8th. Thinking back, yeah, it was October 8th. On the October 8th meeting with Richardson said that FDR said, you know, if they attack the Dutch East Indies, if they attack the Kra Peninsula, which is Malaysia, if they attack Thailand, right, if they attack the Philippines, I doubt we'll be able to enter the war. But then they will not be able to keep avoiding mistakes, and somewhere along the line, you know, as the area of operations expands, he said, right, they'll make a mistake which will justify our entry into the war, which means he wanted to enter the war. He wanted to have Japan do something under war. Plus, he understood that by stating those four places, he knew oil was key, right? Oil can be gotten. But he also knew that the attack is going to have to be closer to home. Philippines was a U.S. possession. That was U.S. territory. But it's probably distant in the American public mind. So Roosevelt was a very smart, cagey person, a very clever politician. He knew the psyche of Americans, how that would be, you know, almost inconsequential. Taking the Philippines inconsequential to Americans, but not to Pearl Harbor. An attack there would rally Americans. So he knew that the attack had to be closer to America. All right. So then there's 29 messages. Japan's panic over oil. They're panicked over oil. I don't think I put this in my documents. I found all these messages. I went through every damn Japanese message. There's like 270 pages of Japanese messages that we had intercepted and decoded, right? And I went through every single one with a fine-tooth comb. There's 5 messages. Japan fears war with the U.S. if oil's cut off. July 25th, U.S., UK, and Dutch all cut off oil on the same day, simultaneously. I mean, this is no accident, right? This is a plan. So we know from umpteen sources that Japan's going to go to war if we cut off oil. And then we cut off oil, right? And then after that, there were 7 panic messages citing November 25th as a deadline. Please get, negotiations. That negotiations pointed toward getting oil back, right? Get it done, get it successful by November 25th, or things are automatically going to happen, right? That was the phrase the Japanese used. All right, so in addition to that, we have testimony from Richardson, who said FDR wants war. A number of times he repeatedly said, FDR wants to get us into this war. Admiral Richardson and Admiral Stark. So Admiral Richardson is Admiral of the Fleet. Admiral Stark is Chief of Naval Operations, overall in charge of the Navy, right, the highest ranking naval officer. And both of them say FDR wants to sacrifice U.S. ships to get us into the war. In fact, Stark wrote a letter to FDR. Remember when I said this is probably a cover your ass letter in case things went to the way they expected. U.S. ships are lost, and someone had to be sacrificed. Well, Admiral Stark was like, "This is not going to be me," right? So that's what I believe, because there really wasn't a justifiable reason for sending that letter. If you think about it. A provocation plan. So October 7th, you had a provocation plan. It was a plan against Japan, and it included 8 action items, which were to be taken against Japan. Which the guy who wrote this, Commander McCullough, said that it would be good if this would induce Japan into attacking. These would induce Japan to attacking. Intelligence warning Japan planning to attack Pearl Harbor. So we had well in advance, in January of 1940, Ambassador Grew cabled to Washington that he had solid intelligence that Japan is planning to attack at Pearl Harbor, and he said it came from multiple sources, including one Japanese, right? And what we know after the war is that Yamamoto actually started preparing the attack in November, a couple months prior to this, 2 months prior to the warning that Grew got and sent. Now, that warning was sent, I believe it was January 27th, 4 days later, and January 31st. I'm pretty sure it's January 31st. That's when McCullough sent a message. So he's the guy who wrote the plan to provoke Japan to war. He sends a message to all Pacific bases: disregard the Grew warning, right? U.S. naval intelligence holds no credence in such rumors. Now, when he sent that, U.S. naval intelligence had already intercepted 9 of the 24 messages targeting Pearl Harbor, right? And they didn't say that. So prior to Pearl Harbor, there's 20 intercepted messages targeting Pearl Harbor, right? We know they're going to attack. Well, we don't know for sure, but there's clearly planning to attack Pearl Harbor, right? Clearly there's intelligence gathering to attack Pearl Harbor. And then we had classic indications of war we intercepted. We intercepted messages, decoded them, ordering the destruction of code machines and codes, right? Classic indication a country's getting ready to go to war. And they had orders to recall dependents. Another classic indication that a country's going to war. And that, in fact, was what do I want to say here? That, in fact, was part of the 30-day plan, right? Recalling dependents. However, that's one of the things they didn't do, as far as I know, from my research back then. I didn't find any evidence that there was a call to recall. There's a call to recall American dependents out of Vietnam. No, so, and then we get 7 messages. We know Japan's desperation, right, from 29 messages and so forth, right? And then we get the 20. We know from 7 messages that November 25th is their deadline, all right? And then when November 25th rolls around, we know the entire Japanese fleet has gotten underway, right? The Southern Fleet is spotted off Formosa, heading south, carrying 5 Army divisions. Northern Fleet went totally radio silent, which Admiral Turner testified. That meant we knew he got underway, right? And he said it was at least a 50-50 chance, attacking Pearl Harbor. With 24 messages targeting Pearl Harbor, I'm thinking it's a little bit more than 50-50. But anyways, they knew it was a high chance they'll attack Pearl Harbor. No warning sent. Now, once the FDR team knew the attack was underway, they took actions to open Pearl Harbor to attack. They rerouted ships through the Straits of Torres, clearing the way for the Northern Fleet to attack Hawaii without any U.S. ships bumping into them. They sent the carriers away the very next day. So on November 25th, we know that's a deadline. We know the attack is on the way. We reroute ships on that day away from the path where the Northern Fleet, if they were to attack Pearl Harbor, they could bump into them. Right? We send the carriers away. Then we send the whole ultimatum, which put the final nail in the box, declaring that we're not negotiating anymore. So hopefully, we'll tell the Japanese that there's no turning back. Although as we know from intercepted messages, Japan set up open telephone code where if they said certain words, that meant negotiations have succeeded, and there was a telephone line set up directly to Admiral Yamamoto from the Japanese diplomats in Washington, and he can call immediately, radio that a return of the ships. So they're hoping for negotiations up until the last minute. We declared them over, received the declaration of war. So FDR received the declaration of war on December 6th, and there was no warning given. So here's some confessions. Icky said it was easy to get into the war, by cutting off oil, right? He said, if we go to war with Japan, we'll go to war with Germany, right? Stimson said we had to maneuver Japan into attacking us to get public support for war. We knew the attack was coming, and we had to let them attack, right? The McCullum said that also. Right after he said he wrote the 8 action items, he said, it'll be good if this would induce Japan to attack. Okay. This is the actual attack route, right? This is the path. There's Vladivostok right there, right? That's so U.S. ships, Lend-Lease ships would be crossing here. There's a chance, whatever probability is, there's a chance they could have run across the Japanese fleet as it's coming across, but they're rerouted way down south. Here's let's see, where's all right, there's Wake, there's Guam. So the Philippines is about here, right? That means the Dutch East Indies are down here somewhere, right? This is New Guinea. Here's the Solomon. They're rerouted way down here. That's right here, actually, right? So here is this is where the Japanese fleet left from. They followed a path like this, then they arc down here, right? Here is Vladivostok right there. U.S. ships going to Vladivostok, having to go through the Japanese islands, which the Japanese complained about in their diplomatic messages, right? Those ships are rerouted through the Straits of Torres, right down there, right? Not much further south. You go any further south, you're getting close, to Antarctica. It's coming. Antarctica's down here somewhere. All right. All right, and then if you look at the attack, where Japan attacked, everything was centered on oil. That was their key objective. In Americans' minds, it's Pearl Harbor, but no, right? That was a sideshow for the Japanese. Right? That was trying to prevent, opposition to the invasion of the Philippines and the support of the Philippines amphibious landing and ground force operations, right? Also possibly to prevent U.S. ships from interdicting Japanese oil flows, and also any other resource flows, to Japan. All right, so that's Pearl Harbor. Get a detonator. Pearl Harbor was a detonator, right? And okay, so let's take a look at World War I. All right. Okay, World War I, 1914, 1918 or so. And big war. First World War, war to end all wars. Yeah, right. Okay, it was largely a static line war, trench warfare, right? They didn't have highly mechanized maneuver warfare. I mean, the first real mechanized war, you could say, was probably the Franco-Prussian War. You know, they used trains, right? Trains were used during the U.S. Civil War, but not to the extent, you know, and effect of the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War. But that broke down, all right, with these static lines until you had tanks, armor, right, come into play, which were first developed by the British in World War One. All right, so now in World War One, how the U.S. got involved in this war, there were two key detonators, right? One happened early in 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship built by the Cunard Company, the same company that built the Titanic, right? And then the second one was German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare against U.S. shipping in February 1st of 1917, followed by the sinking of several U.S. ships. That Wilson petitioned Congress to pass a declaration of war, which they did, right? And thus we got the war. All right, so how did these detonators occur? Well, let's take a look at the first detonator, the sinking of the Lusitania. Here's Boston Journal headlines. Hundreds of lives are lost on a torpedo Lusitania. Then New York Times saying, you know, probably 1,000 dead, and there's actually more than 1,000, almost 200. And then Seattle Star saying Lusitania sunk, 1,400 folk aboard, right? Now, for the American public perception, right, to kill all these civilians, innocent civilians, a passenger ship, a civilian passenger ship was, you know, just, and not just unconscionable, but horrifying, right? You know, unarmed civilian passenger ship, bloody Germans, murderous, right? You know, this is not accidental. This is premeditated murder on a mass scale, barbarous villainy, right? Innocent unarmed civilians brutally murdered without provocation, without warning, right? And sure enough, it was a surprise attack. There was no warning, right? Effects: American public was shocked, right? Angry, and it went a long way in shifting sentiment against Germany, shifting American public sentiment against Germany. All right. Now, Germans had a different perspective, right? They knew that the U.S. was shipping mountains of weapons, ammunition, and other war materials on British passenger ships, including the Lusitania, right? These war materials are being used to kill German boys. And roughly half of all Allied munitions fired on the Western Front, you know, that was Britain and France versus Germany. Eastern Front was Russia versus Germany, primarily, were made in the USA, right? So the U.S. made more than either Britain or France individually, right? More the munitions. So the U.S. and British were using civilians as human shields. So these civilians, if we're shipping weapons and ammunition aboard the Lusitania, right, then those civilians are actually being used as human shields. And Germany said, you can't justify that. You can't do that, right? And so they wanted to make, you know, given the fact that these munitions are being used to kill German boys, they wanted to set an example. And they decided to use the transit of the Lusitania. So the Germans wanted to attack the Lusitania to try to get this practice stopped. And they did their due diligence in trying to get the Wilson administration to issue a warning to U.S. citizens not to travel on the Lusitania. The Wilson administration refused. And the key guy behind that was Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State. And he wrote the diplomatic response communication. And I read his memoirs, you know, and he bragged about this, how brilliant it was, and how he wrote it for public consumption, right? It basically, you know, it was basically similar to, it was kind of like a cover your ass in the aftermath. Anyways, so that's what we're doing. We're shipping weapons aboard them. The construction. So there's other factors. Construction of the Lusitania was financed by the British Royal Navy, and it was intended to serve as an auxiliary cruiser or a passenger troop transport during wartime. You know, that's a minor fact. Lusitania was listed in Jane's warships as an auxiliary cruiser. Minor fact. Lusitania was reported in newspapers to have been armed with cannons, but it wasn't. it had gun mounts installed in preparation for the cannons, but there were no cannons as yet. Now, something more key is what made surprise sneak attack, necessary was British policies, and you kind of have to understand the international law at the time, which was rooted primarily upon the old practice of mercantilism. In mercantilism, money was king, and it justified trade with combatants, right? And maintaining neutrality and so forth. And it set certain stipulations like you can interdict a ship, let's say, carrying items to a combatant country, let's say to England, right? But you cannot sink it outright. You have to approach it, hail it to halt, and that ship has to submit to inspection, right? You have to board the ship, and then you inspect for contraband. If there's any contraband, you can destroy the contraband, or if it's not feasible to destroy it all there, throw it overboard, then you can destroy the ship, but not until you do an inspection, right? So kind of, by today's standards, we think that's somewhat, somewhat ridiculous. So now the British policy, the British naval policy, they ordered arming of merchant ships, right? Evaded inspection, don't submit to inspection, try to outrun the German submarines, right? And ram German U-boats, so they tried to inspect you, rammed them, and they used Q ships, which were merchant ships with gun mounts. As I recall reading, it was they typically British used 6-pounders, and they had screens hiding them. And when the German submarine would come alongside to inspect, they would drop the screens and open fire, and it's pretty easy to sink a U-boat, especially from close range. U-boats, submarines have 2 holes, a pressure hole internal and an outer ballast hole, and both of which are not that thick. They're not armored. The ballast hole is probably about a ½ inch thick. The pressure hole back then, for example, I saw a U-boat, German U-boat during World War II, the U-505, in the Science and Industry Museum in Chicago. And I looked, as you go through, they have the openings for tourists to walk through, and it's cut into the side of the submarine. So you can see the wall thickness, and the ballast hole is only about a ½ inch thick. The pressure hole itself, you would think it'd be thicker, but it's only about 3/4 of an inch thick, right? And both of those could be pierced by just a machine gun fire, let alone a cannon, right? A .50 caliber machine gun can go through a ½ inch pretty easily. All right, okay, yeah. So, that made inspections problematic. So they decided they had to sink these ships. But that turned American public opinion. So the German plan backfired. They wanted to make an example of Lusitania, right, to stop this, but it backfired big time, and shifting U.S. public opinion strongly against Germany, which is a huge strategic move. Okay, so then the next big detonator was the German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st of 1917, and they sunk several ships, I believe 4 ships. Then Wilson petitioned Congress to declare war, and they did, right? Now, the U.S. policy was to maintain a one-sided weapons trade with Britain and France while claiming neutrality. Because we are neutral, according to our definition and the international law, right? Germans cannot sink any U.S. ships, even though we're sending basically mountains of weapons and munitions over there. Then we also claim Germans cannot sink any British ships which have an American on board. At least one American on board, you can't sink the British ship. So that was our stated policy. Somewhat unrealistic, you could say, especially from today's standards, right? So German went with this for many years, up until 1917, from the start of the war to 1917. And there was a lot of debate in Germany what to do about this, and there was, the hard-nosed people, maybe like the right-wing type people were saying, let's declare unrestricted submarine warfare. And then there were other people who argued against it, saying, no, this is bad. This is gonna compound the problem, right? So in my research, going through all the arguments, I identified 10 arguments for unrestricted warfare, and there were 8 arguments that I found against it. So I want to go through these arguments to show that it wasn't a rash policy, a rash decision from the average American who just opens a paper one day. Oh, those crazy, bloody, barbarian Germans, right? Sinking our ships. It was well considered, even though maybe they chose wrong. But this are the arguments. There are 10 arguments for it and 8 arguments against. The first argument is, U.S. is claiming to be neutral, but that's a lie. U.S. was already at war with Germany, industrially. The U.S. war industry operated at full capacity, and industry is the backbone of warfighting capability, right? Manufacture weapons and munitions for the British and French. Half of the munitions fired in the Western Front were made in USA, right? So neutrality was a lie. They're not really neutral. Therefore, war with the U.S. would make little material difference. So they believe that we're already at war with them, and they believe that if we actually go to war, with declared war, well, that's not going to really change much, right? Since it was estimated that U.S. war production was already near full capacity. This was not true. We had a capacity to expand greatly. The limitation was in financing. Prior to U.S. entry into the war, financing for military production of war materials was through private banks. Key guy organizing that was J.P. Morgan, organizing, I guess, a group of a lot of banks. J.P. Morgan played a big role in there, as I recall from my research way back. My research was like 1992, 3. Anyways, the limitation was in financing war production. So we had far more capacity to produce. U.S. has great industrial capacity. It was believed that U.S. shipment of war materials was limited by shipping capacity, freight capacity. So this is believed to be the choke point, right? And this would not appreciably increase for a year after U.S. entry into the war. They believe it's going to take a while to build these ships, and it would take a while to build these ships. All right. Although it's been shown that in wartime you can ramp up production very rapidly. For example, World War II, they're building Liberty ships like, I don't know, they're building like Liberty ships like one a day almost, as I recall. Let me see if I can look it up real quick. How fast were Liberty ships built? Okay. Liberty ships. It took 4 days. 4 days, 15 hours to build a Liberty ship. All right. So I don't know how fast, how many they're building per day. It took 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. Oh, this ship, SS Robert E. Perry, built in 4 days. All right. Liberty ships, workhorse, were built in 13 states by company. So we're building those like crazy. All right. Where are we at here? Okay. Yeah, but that was believed that the limitation, the choke point would be freight capacity. It was expected to decrease with unrestricted submarine warfare, right? Yeah, obviously, if you start sinking them, you're gonna cut into that freight capacity. And that happened during World War II. There was, it was touch and go. We were losing, at the start of the war, we were losing a lot of tonnage of ships early on before we got our act together. With the U.S. entry into the war, U.S. provision of war materials to the British and French will actually diminish as they will divert those materials to outfit their own armies. So they're worried about the war materials going to the people who are fighting them right now. The people fighting Germany right now were the British and the French, and they believe that if America enters the war, those war materials going to them would diminish because they'd be diverted to outfit their armies, which they had to form and then accoutre or outfit with weapons and munitions and so forth, right? So it would relieve pressure, as far as the enemy who's fighting them right now. U.S. forces would not be effective for at least a year. It would take time for the U.S. to establish their armies, right? Then outfit them and then train them, right? So we think of today of our military being a permanent establishment, and it has been since World War II. At the end of World War II, we went straight into the Cold War, and it's been a permanent. We've had a permanent war establishment, military establishment, with pretty much a permanent war economy since you could say mid-June of middle of 1940, like June of 1940. All right, with the big first appropriation bills in preparation for World War II. But prior to that, we would dismantle our militaries during peacetime. We would put little into them, so we'd have to start from scratch. There was little pre-existing military forces, right? And so they believed it would take time for us to get our forces organized and outfitted. So they believed the U.S. forces would not be that effective for at least a year, which wasn't true. They made a lot of mistakes in their judgment here. On the other hand, it was believed that an unrestricted submarine campaign could bring victory within 6 months. This was not true, too. This is optimistic. Key things were the financing. I believe that was the key. Financing was the key to the U.S. impact of entering the war. U.S., British, and French financial capacity to fund the war was stretched pretty thin. It was production was in the form of loans, credits, and bond issues. Was already strained. It would not appreciably increase with the war. Right? This was false. Right? So, like I said, prior to U.S. entry into the war, the financing for all the war production that went to Britain and France had to go through private banks. Right? And those private banks had to get financing from somewhere, and they're being financed by Britain and France floating bond issues, right? So they're passing U.S. bonds, passing to the U.S. banks bonds, right? Those bonds are promissory notes, basically stating we'll pay you back so much at a certain date, right? Now the problem was, the more and more bonds you get, right, their value decreases. U.S. banks are so soaked with bonds, all right. British and French bonds, and furthermore, those bond values were threatened. If Germany won the war, Britain and France lost the war, those bonds would be worthless, and that would completely obliterate the U.S. banking system, right? The U.S. banking system would crumble, and then we have a Great Depression. But with the U.S. entry into the war, right, now the federal government could issue its own bonds, its own war bonds, and it can just basically manufacture debt. So it opened the door to huge financing, and that was key. I believe the key factor in U.S. entry into that war. The German war effort on the Western Front had gone badly in 1916, and unrestricted summer warfare was seen as a means of providing badly needed material and psychological relief to the troops at the front, right? So, it would help boost the war had gone bad for the Germans in 1916, so they believed that the submarine war would be a morale boost for the troops in the field. Hopefully, give them some light at the end of the tunnel. While it was demanded that Germany not conduct unrestricted submarine warfare, the British maintained an illegal blockade, which was starving Germany. So the key thing was that we're going to like international law, right? You you can't do unrestricted, sneak attacks, right? Right? And that's breaking the law, all right? Well, the British were breaking the law. A full blockade was against international law, likewise. But they held that against Germany. England was seen as the key to the Allied war effort, and maritime commerce was England's Achilles heel. So England was key to maintaining this effort, especially war materials going into U.S. war materials going into England, right? And commerce was the key to keeping England alive. So they cut that off. That would be, the key to German victory, they believed. All right. So the arguments against U.S. entry into the war, with U.S. entry into the war, the Allies' war effort would receive a substantial boost in morale, greatly increasing their ability to sustain the war effort. That's true. Conversely, German morale would take a devastating blow if the U.S. entered. U.S. entry into the war might create dissension among the Central Powers, threatening the coalition, right? Other neutral nations, nations who did not enter the war, who were possibly threatened by Germany, right, like Scandinavian states and Switzerland, had indicated that they might declare war if the U.S. threw in for war against Germany, right? Then they're like, okay, yeah, we'll enter. So that would compound their problem. U.S. military forces will have more immediate impact in less than a year. It won't take over a year. Quick victory through unrestricted summer warfare was overly optimistic, right? That turned out to be true. So these guys were more right on target. U.S. financing would be greatly increased with federal financing through war bond issues. Thus, financing of war production would no longer be limited to already strained, British and French bond issues, right? While U.S. forces may not be ready for at least a year, there'll be an immediate spike in U.S. volunteers to British and French units. I'm not sure if that happened or not, right? And there were a lot of American volunteers to British and French units. All right, so that's World War One. The two key detonators were seeking the Lusitania and unrestricted warfare. But in both cases, we're shipping a lot of weapons on those, right? So we played a hand in that. But those were the two key things that got America into the war. All right. Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain. Right. This was our first big propaganda war. Two key players in the propaganda were newspapermen Hearst and Pulitzer. Right. They were actually competing in New York papers. Right. They would pass fake, phony stories like this. Strip searching of American women, and you have a naked woman, American woman there, right, with her tush being exposed there, and then you get these like villainous, creepy-looking, Spaniards who's got like this devilish goatee, right, right. Okay, then here you have Spanish politeness. There's the U.S.'s Maine in the background sunk, and you got Spain here with the oh yeah, okay. Like it looks like all sneaky and snivelly, like Peter Lorre or something like that. Like Peter Lorre contemplating a crime, and then he's got a knife behind his back with blood dripping off of it, And there's innocent Uncle Sam, and then you have the paper, crisis at hand, Spanish treachery, okay, blowing up the Maine. Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo. Was it? Okay, was it a bomb or torpedo? Now, the sinking of the U.S. Maine in Havana Harbor was a key detonator justification of the war. It's still a mystery how the USS Maine blew up, but we blame Spain. And blaming Spain, we declared war against Spain. Well, what happened actually was, again, this is they passed a congressional resolution authorizing the president to take action against Spain. Right? He set up a naval blockade of Cuba, right, which is an act of war, and that's what got us into the war. Okay, so we went to war with Spain over the USS Maine. Three possibilities: Spain did it, it was an accident, or we did it. Admiral Rickover did an analysis of the U.S. Spain damage from all the evidence, pictures, and so forth, right? And he said it was an accident. We'll talk about that later, right? So who did it? Who knows? But we blame Spain, and we went to war with Spain. So this is where it blew up. There's Havana. Here's Havana Harbor today. I'm not sure if it looked like that back then, but it was probably somewhat similar. Kind of reminds me of something like Pearl Harbor a little bit. But so they blew up the main blew up there, and that was a key thing that kicked off the war. Here's some more propaganda stuff where you have a Spanish guy who looks like a gorilla, half man, half gorilla. He's all hairy and looks pretty primitive. And there was a tombstone, Maine sailors, right, murdered, right? And you got this Spanish guy with a bloody red hand, blood-soaked hand hair dripping down. He's got a knife, right? Big, nasty-looking knife, curved blade, and he's got blood dripping off of there, right? And then in the background, you have all these American sailors lying dead. Okay, and you got a jungle, right? Like he's an animal. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go into the background behind the Spanish-American War, right? And try to give a broader picture, the economic picture, like most of our wars, the real basis was economics. Okay, so background, prior to the Civil War, all right, the political battle was centered between North and South. The industrial manufacturing North versus the agrarian slave plantation South, right? And this battle restricted Western expansion. It restricted Western expansion from the formation of our nation. We gained our independence and whatever we declared our independence in '76, right? And then we ratified the Constitution in 1789. Formally establishing the United States, whatever, right? And from that point, slavery was a key, a key battle line. But it wasn't slavery; it was the economics of each system, right? Two different economic systems, and politics was involved, right? So politics was important because whoever controlled the politics and controlled legislation, which controlled economic policy, and that determined the fate, the prosperity or the death of an economic system, right? So, okay. Now, the policy back then, from the inception of the United States, the policy was to, for every state that joined the Union, every territory that joined was admitted as a state. Let's say in the South, there had to be a state admitted in the North, a free state versus a slave state, right? To maintain the political balance, right? And the idea is, with each new state, you have two senators, right, to maintain that balance, and also you have umpteen congressmen, depending upon the demographics, what the population is. Okay. All right. So background: prior to the Civil War, the political battle between North and South restricted Western expansion, right? And the big reason why is because there's a battle over entry of statehood, right? To balance the politics, like I told you, right? There's all sorts of issues. It's very complicated. There was the Missouri Compromise and so forth with the Louisiana Purchase, right? And then also there was the acquisition of new territories, all the Southwest, right? And I'm not going to get into all the issues. It's too complicated to get into issues of slavery and statehood here. But with the Civil War, so the politics was centered upon financial power, economic power, and the South was basically blocking Northern efforts me see if I can come up with a diagram here that would better explain it. I explained it in my let's see. Okay, so here's like a summary of the Northern policy, right? They wanted land grant colleges, they wanted free land, right? National currency, national bank, wage labor, high tariffs. All of these were opposed by the South, right? These, they believed, national currency, national bank would give too much power to the North, right? They wanted to acquire the land. They didn't want land given away free, right? The Southern land aristocrats wanted to gobble up the land, right? They wanted low tariffs. High tariffs would kill the Southern cotton trade, right? North wanted wage labor. And I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but this is what they did. As soon as the Civil War started, they implemented their program. So the first thing was March 2nd, they passed the moral tariff, high tariff, right? Next thing they did was national paper currency, greenback, right? National currency. Prior to this, there wasn't a national currency. It was the wildcat banking era, right, where every bank issued its own paper, right? Whatever, bond issues or currency, whatever. Then you had the Homestead Act, free land. So they're rushing to implement all their policy, free land, right? Transcontinental Railroad, right? That's up here. Land grant colleges, okay? National Banking Act, so they got a national bank, right? All of this was opposed by the South. So this was the Northern economic agenda, and they rushed to implement this. Did they move to free the slaves? No, they didn't move. They didn't lift a finger until the very last minute at the end of the war. Largely pushed by Lincoln. All right, so the Civil War opened up the way for Western expansion, which drove U.S. economic growth for the next 30 years, roughly, the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age it's known for the period of the highest rate of U.S. economic growth during that period. Essentially, what the Western expansion was European colonial expansion within our own territory. So I showed this picture showing how the Europeans colonized all these places. They colonized Africa, and they competed for colonies here, right? They colonized the Americas. This is all Spanish stuff initially. Here's Portuguese. What's down here? Dutch, I think. I think this is British. What was that? Guyana? Is Guyana British? Guyana is British Guyana. Okay. This is British. Okay. Right. And during early industrialization, industrial economics, for the Europeans, it was expansion into colonies, which was a big engine that drove their industrial growth. They gained the resources needed for their industries, right? And also in expanding into those territories, especially with the development of trains, right? That development of transportation infrastructure, the shipping, and also trains and rails, that was also a stimulus for industrial growth, industrial production, steel and whatnot, right? Manufacturing. And then at the same time, they would use the territories of the colonies as markets to export their surplus manufactured goods, right? So the whole thing was an economic engine, and it required developing these colonies, expanding into the territories, gaining greater access to both resources and markets, right? So I say the economics of colonial expansion, driving industrial development, and also that led to colonial competition. This became the key means. Now, we did the same thing. What the Europeans did in going into other nations, other territories, we could do in our own backyard, right? Of course, we had to kick out the Indians or kill them off, right, as we expanded west. But that drove industrial growth, the key engine. Essentially, it was European colonial expansion in our own territory, all right? Now, Now, in 1890, a famous admiral, very smart man, Admiral Alfred T. Mahan, published a book called The Influence of Sea Power in History. And these are key elements of his book, right? Elements of Mahan's doctrine. He said the U.S. economy is driven by Western expansion. Currently, investments are going into Western expansion, or internal resource development, as he called it, right? Which is Western expansion, because that returns the greatest profits, right? That's where you invest in what returns the greatest profits, right? But there will come a day when markets will saturate, when the economy is going to tank, basically. You have overinvestment, overcapitalization. This is a typical pattern. You have insufficient real demand, causing investments to fail. This is a typical pattern of forming what's called a bubble, right? So what happens is a lot of this is based in human nature. When you got a good thing going, when it's making profit, when you have great profits being poured out of something, you want to pour more money into it, more investments, right? So people would take out loans. They would leverage themselves highly, right? And they pour more and more money into what's making money for them, right? However, what happens is the amount of investment starts to exceed any real consumption demand, right? And then prices are still rising, but prices are rising largely due to the formation of a bubble being driven, by like an example of housing, by speculation and so forth, right? Which exceeds any real demand, and then at some point the bubble bursts and it crashes, and all these investments fail, right? And once they fail, then people have trouble paying back the loans, so they default on the loans, and then banks are hit by all these loan defaults, and so they risk going under, right? And as soon as people who have their deposits in those banks, and banks, banks don't keep all the money that they receive in deposit, they loan it out, right? So if there's a chance a bank is going to go under, then people make runs in the banks, and they'll make a run in the bank, try to get the money out, and then the bank goes under. And then what happens is if banks go under across the country, right? Then the capital for investment dries up, and capital for doing daily business dries up, and that kills the economy, and the economy tanks, and you have a depression. So this is the typical pattern of a business cycle, right? And okay, so and then what Mahan said that once this happens, once the internal resource development dries up as the best source of investment, we're going to have to go overseas, just like the British, French, and Germans did, right? He said this in his book. Economic growth would require expansion into overseas commerce, just like Britain, France, Germany, right? Specifically into China and Japan is what he pointed towards, right? Now, to conduct overseas commerce, we need power projection. We have to be able to protect our shipping lanes. We have to protect our interests overseas, right? To prevent commerce interdiction, to protect lines of communication. It was more law of the jungle back then. That's been a typical pattern, right? He who controlled the seas controlled shipping lanes. He who controlled shipping lanes also controlled territories, right? You control that. You control the commerce. And the commerce is the wealth of nations. And that wealth of nations is translated into military power, right? So the overall power of nations was highly dependent upon your commerce. And that's why Great Britain was a dominant force for a number of centuries, right? Is because they had a dominant naval power, naval force, right? They beat the French, beat the Spanish, and so forth. All right. So Power projection. You need power projection. Power projection requires one, acquisition of strategic choke points, and Mahan in his book pointed towards the similarity between the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. He said we need coaling stations. Prior to naval fuel oil burners, steamships were powered by coal. And coal is very limited as far as energy content, largely due to the fact, well, for a number of reasons. I'm not going to get into all the engineering details of it here. I will in the next lesson. But for a number of reasons, it's limited. It's limited in energy, half the energy content per volume than oil. You can't have closed fuel oil boilers because you have to keep shoveling in coal, limited temperatures, and limited force draft, and so forth, efficiency of burning fuel. Anyways, it resulted in a shorter range of ships and required that you have coaling stations all along the way, especially in the long stretches across the Pacific, right? And he said we need a Panama Canal to connect the East Coast manufacturing center with Asia, right? So I'll first talk about strategic choke points. Mahan first explained the Mediterranean, and he identified key choke points. He said that Gibraltar was key here, right? He said that Spain would hold the dominant position as far as transit to and from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, a key for commerce, right? And they would hold a dominant position if it were not for the fact that the British held Gibraltar, which is in the southern point there of Spain, on the northern part of that Gibraltar Straits. And then he said Italy would hold a dominant position in the central Mediterranean, given its position strategically, if it were not for the fact that the British held Sardinia and the French held Corsica. The British also held Malta. Key point about Malta, where is Malta? I guess Malta is right around there. Is that Malta? Anyways, Malta was key in World War II. So what Mahan said proved to be, in a sense, prophetic. In the North African campaign, you had General Rommel, brilliant general, going against a number of different British generals. Who was it was going against? Anyways, the final one was Montgomery, and Rommel didn't lose to Montgomery. Rommel lost because the Germans lost the logistical support battle, which was in the Mediterranean here. And the key to that was not just British warships, British submarines. British had aircraft carrier in there. I think it was one of the Ark Royal or something like that. I know they had an aircraft carrier in there. But the key was they held Malta. And they had an air base there. And with that, they could interdict German supply ships, troop transports coming along the way. So, Rommel wasn't defeated by Montgomery. Rommel was defeated by lack of fuel, lack of resupply, lack of tanks, lack of soldiers, everything, munitions. So it proved to be significant. And all right, so Mahan said in his book that the Mediterranean is very similar to the Caribbean, right? The key places in the Caribbean were like Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba was key because it guarded the western access to the planned Trans-Isthmus Canal. He said we need to have a Trans-Isthmus Canal, which eventually became the Panama Canal, right? To facilitate shipping from the East Coast industrial base of the United States to Asia, and that Cuba guarded the western access to that. Also, it guarded the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, which was huge because all, for example, the building materials and agriculture that comes out of the breadbasket here, in central United States, if they're going to be shipped via water, which is a lot cheaper than rail, to the industrial eastern United States, right? If, for example, a European power were to acquire that, and we went to war with them, or had some sort of conflict with them, they can interdict our shipping by holding Cuba. So he said it was strategic there in the western axis. Puerto Rico is strategic in the eastern axis to the Trans-Isthmus Canal. Then as far as coaling stations, given the limited range of coal-fired steam boilers, we needed to take coaling stations all along the way to Asia. And then we need the Panama Canal, right? So Trans-Isthmus Canal became the Panama Canal, right? So these are elements of Mahan's plan, right? What he said. Now, in 1893, the market saturated, crashed. There was a great panic. The U.S. economy crashed, and we're in depression until the Spanish-American War. In 1895, that's when we first started going into started U.S. expansion into Central and South America. All right, the first big moves in 1895. So just like Mahan said, given that Western expansion saturated and was tapped out, we got to expand overseas. So we just started expanding south, right? 1895, and this began U.S. imperialism. This was the first U.S. imperialism. It's like the start of U.S. imperialism. It began before them, but it was a significant jump in U.S. imperialism. And we didn't practice imperialism in the sense of European nations, setting up colonies. We didn't do colonialization. We did more neo-colonial, practiced more neo-colonialism. I'll explain that later, right? One of the few colonies that we took was the Philippines. Western expansion was considered to be colonial expansion, but it was different because we're just kicking off and killing the Indians and putting them onto reservations, right? It wasn't that we're setting up government within those Indian populations. We're just isolating them or killing them off. All right, so now a key thing that kicked off the race to carve up Asia was the German occupation of Shandong, China in 1897, which set off a race between Britain, France, and Russia, Japan, to carve up China into what are called spheres of influence, where they would dominate the economics, the resources, the markets in those territories. And then in 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, right? So it exploded. We blamed Spain, provoked the war, and then we made our first attack in the Philippine Islands. So we provoked the war by setting up a naval blockade of Spain, which is an act of war. If you have a naval blockade, the reason why naval blockade is a classic act of war is because you're cutting off a resource. You're cutting off commerce, right? And what is commerce? Commerce is the lifeblood of a nation. You cut off the lifeblood of the nation, right? They have to go to war. So we blame Spain, they provoke a war, then make our first attack in the Philippine Islands. So our first attack was not Cuba, Havana, where the main blew up. We first attacked the Philippines. Now the Philippines were important because they are the key strategic islands in this whole Asia theater here. All of Asia essentially wraps around the Philippines in an arc, no more than 600 miles apart, right? Roughly 600-mile arc. And so they're the key strategic islands in Asia. And that, in fact, is why the Japanese had to take the Philippines. If they were going to take the Dutch East Indies, they had to kick the U.S. forces out of here, right? if they were to get their oil back to Japan, uh, and also all the resource flow through that area. They had to eliminate the U.S. Overseas presence here. These were strategic. Um, okay. All right. So what happened is the USS Maine blew up there. We made a first attack here. Then we took Cuba. We took Puerto Rico. We annexed Hawaii same year. Midway we had already. We took Wake from the Spain. We took Guam. Right. We took Samoa down here. And then John Hay issued the open door policy in 1898, demanding that the U.S. gain access to the China market, right? So these are all elements of Mahan's plan. And then 2 years later, a couple of years later, we helped foment the revolution in Colombia. Colombia was this part of South America, plus that portion which is Panama, right? Up to here. And in exchange for our assistance in that revolution, we acquired the Panama Canal Zone, right? So these are all elements of the Mahan plan, right? Being put into effect, taking Cuba, taking Puerto Rico, taking all these stepping stones, the coaling stations all along the way, taking the Philippines, which were the key strategic islands in that region. These were huge in importance. And then we issued the John Hay open door policy, demanding we get access to both the China and Japanese markets. Right? So all these are elements of the Mahan plan. Okay. All right. So, yeah, we take all the key Spanish possessions. We have the open door policy. Two of the key men who pushed for war hard. Henry Cabot Lodge was he was a senator. He pushed hard for that resolution. Teddy Roosevelt pushed hard for the war. And both of these men were Mahan disciples, right? They were committed Mahan disciples. Then we attained the Panama Canal Zone by supporting the revolution in Colombia. All right. So next thing I want to talk about is Admiral Rickover. Admiral Rickover is this fella here. He was a high-ranking naval officer, and he's considered the father of the U.S. nuclear navy. A brilliant guy, almost like single-handed driving force behind the development of the Navy nuclear power program. This is the first submarine he designed, the Nautilus, first nuclear submarine. There's the nuclear reactors there. All right. So he did analysis and published a book, a Navy Blue Jackets book, published by the U.S. Navy in 1976, and it's based upon him and his team of analysts, engineers. They analyzed the explosion of the Maine, and they said this is the conclusion. It was an internal explosion instead of external. The explosion was caused by internal explosion in the forward munitions magazine, probably caused by coal dust explosion in an adjacent coal bunker, right? So here is the forward gun mount. Right below that is the forward ammunition magazine. Right to the side is that coal bunker, right? And it's happened in the past where, if there was heat and if coal dust gets kicked up into the air, you're always shoveling coal and so forth, right? And it can throw particles in the air. You can get an explosive mixture, and then if there's a spark, right, that coal bunker could go. And if there's an explosion in the coal bunker, that's going to set off the explosion in the munitions magazine, right? And they're in port, they're anchored, so the boilers are here. So maybe the boilers were maybe not more. Well, they're going to have some boilers operating for auxiliary power, I imagine. So a boiler could have gone as well, even though they're in port. So that could have set off a boiler. But anyways, there's a violent explosion. You see the pictures of the explosion here, right? Right. Well, this is a picture of it, a drawing of it. I'm sure it was pretty devastating explosion. All right. So So yeah, he said it was internal. There was another study done, I think by National Geographic or something like that, which said it was also an internal explosion, right? Uh, you know, Spain, you could say, these are all parts of the U.S. motive, right? I mean, you can't prove. The only one you can't prove here is, out of all these detonators, the only one you can't prove that we did it is this one here, right? To this day, it's still unknown who did this. Therefore, because of that, again, this is probably a likely source of attack. They'll probably focus on this one, shift all attention to this one and all the other ones, and attack here, because admittedly, you can't prove who did this, right? But at the same time, you can't prove that Spain did it, right? And we went to war with Spain, took all the possessions, based upon the belief that they did it, right? We said it, they did it, right? Now, Spain had very little motive. Spain was a sick man of Europe, just like the Ottoman Empire was a sick man of Europe. So was Spain. In fact, Admiral Mahan, in his first chapter, outlined rather rudimentary, but he outlined an economic analysis of Spain and why Spain was weak, why Spain was poor, right? Why Spain, was a decrepit, world power, right? Both economically and militarily. It's because he compared it with Great Britain. And, basically the idea is, I'm going to use kind of like modern terminology, but the idea, according to Mahan, was Spain took a wrong tact. What they focused upon was the acquisition of species, money, currency in metals, right? Gold and silver, right? Both of which are not renewable. Both of which have diminishing sources, right? You got to keep finding more sources of it, right? It's not like cotton that you keep growing, or like food, which is replenishable, renewable, right? And it didn't have renewable demand because essentially they were not consumable products, right? So the more gold you acquire, right, basically you start diminishing its value. The more supply you have of gold, right? So you have diminishing returns into production. You have diminishing sources of supply, right? And the real money was made not, and he did emphasize this, was not made in acquiring gold, which you can say is a secondary product, right? A primary resource would be gold, or secondary would be pure gold, or right, and tertiary would be like, I don't know, gold necklace or something like that, right? Right. The profit margins are acquired in value added in production, right? So Spain didn't pursue that, whereas it was England that drove the industrial development, right? Anyways, those are some of the things. Spain was weak. Spain was a sick man of Europe. If they went to war with the U.S., they would lose everything, right? They're barely hanging on to Cuba, all right? And so here's a summary. Explosion and destruction of the U.S.'s Maine was a detonator that moved America to war. So this was a detonator, right? To this day, it's still unknown who did it, right? But we blame Spain, right? And then went to war with them. And then we took key possessions. We basically enacted the Mahan Plan, right? Remember we said Mahan said that you got to take key strategic choke points, and the two choke points were Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and we have to have a canal. We got the Panama Canal. You have to have coaling stations along the way, right? And we took all these possessions. We annexed Hawaii, took Wake and Guam from Spain, took the Philippines from Spain, right? We also took Samoa, and then we issued a John Hay, all in the same year after the Spanish-American War. So now, who really did it? Who really blew up the Maine? Well, there's three possibilities. Spain did it, it was an accident, or the U.S. did it, right? Rickover said the explosion was internal and probably an accident, right? There's no evidence Spain did it. There was no evidence that the U.S. did it. However, you can look at circumstantial evidence. We had the motive. The U.S. economy tanked, and it was, that economy was being driven by Western expansion, and it was still in the depression. We had the plan, right, that both anticipated the economic depression and provided for the solution, which was to expand overseas into Asia, and we started expanding into Central and South America. The key initial large encroachments into Central and South America began in 1895. So Western expansion was the big means of making a profit. When that tanked, we started going down south here, right? And then we made a big effort into Asia in 1898. So we had the, all right, now to conduct the plan, we needed a war with Spain, right? To get all these things, we had to go to war with Spain. We also issued the open door policy indicating motive and intent. Our motive was to get access to that Asian market, which was being threatened by the European powers carving up China into spheres of influence, right? So we demanded our fair share. With the war with Spain, we conducted the plan, including acquisition of the Panama Canal Zone. Finally, we have a history of provoking attacks and sacrificing U.S. military assets to start wars, right? I showed you, right? Gulf of Tonkin, right? Putting that U.S. ship at threat. I showed you Pearl Harbor. Now, who blew up the Maine? Well, it's still up for debate. No one knows, right? But let's look at this like a police crime solving, right? Who had the motive? Well, we had the clear motive for the economic crash of 1893, right? What was that motive? Western expansion drove overseas the industrial, drove the economy, drove economic growth, and drove economic industrial development, right? When that tanked, right, according to Mahan, we'd have to go overseas, right? And who had the plan? Mahan, right? And that was all these things. All these were part of Mahan's plan, right? What was that plan? Well, you take the key strategic points in the Caribbean, you get the Panama Canal, you get coaling stations all along the way, which we did, right? And they issued the John Hay open door policy, demanding our access to the Asian market, all in the same, same time here. Well, a few years later for the Panama Canal. So did we start doing the plan? Well, in 1895, we started going into Central and South America, right? Who pushed for the war? Mahan disciples, Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, right? Was a plan conducted? It looks like. Given the above, what is the most likely cause for the Maine explosion? Well, it's still up in the air. No one knows, right? But we took advantage of it, and we enacted the plan. Can you prove the U.S. did it? No. But can you prove Spain did it? No. But did we use that as an excuse to fight a war to conduct the plan in order to expand into the Asian market? Yes, we did. All right. So attack away. I know you're going to attack that. You're going to try to create a big social reality shift. All right. So let's do a quick review. There was a big push prior to the war to build up propaganda to get a war with Spain in this. So there is a concerted effort to get a war with Spain here. Propaganda effort. Then they got suddenly the Maine explodes, right? Right? Who did it? Who knows? Right? Big driving force behind this was the U.S. economy tanking, right? Western expansion was a key engine that drove the development of the U.S. economy. Sure, there's other elements within it. For example, you had industrialization, you had further improvements in steel, for example, right? That having an impact, for example, on maybe skyscraper production and so forth, right? But the key driving force was Western expansion and, and growth of rail lines, growth of, as you're expanding west, let's see here. Try to give you a simple, all right, as you're expanding west, right, you're developing rail lines all along the way. There was 5 transcontinental rail lines developed by 1895 or so, all right, and this is a time when trains were steam-driven, steam-driven trains, coal-fired or wood-fired, right? And this required water refueling stations every 20 miles or so. So you start developing towns all along the way, little towns all along these rails, right? And each town became a little source for urban development, requiring materials, purchasing materials from the manufacturers, being basically a market for sale of manufactured goods from the East Coast, right? At the same time, they're developing the resources, right? Sending it back to be used for manufacturing in the East Coast, but then making money. And the idea is raw materials, as you expand west, would increase. Those being used for construction, for building manufacturing products in the manufacturing sector of the U.S., right? Money going back in exchange for that. That money being then sent back to purchase goods, right? Manufactured goods. Things needed to develop the infrastructure of a town, from door hinges to chinaware to anything, right? Barber implements to, and that fueling this whole thing, the cyclical flow of money being the velocity of money, this driving economic growth, right? And all right, that tanked in 1893, right? Mahan said it would tank, right? And when it does, we're going to have to go overseas. And that's what we did. We started moving into Central South America in 1895, right? Then we had a big push to go into Asia in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. So a key to the Spanish-American War is not the sinking of the Maine, right? The key driving force here was expansion into Asia. All right, now does that prove that the U.S. blew up the Maine? No, it doesn't. All right, so attack that. All right, but is it pretty clear that we enacted the Mahan Plan? Read his book. He outlines the stuff. All right. I know that people will not read his book. People won't remember the elements of this discussion, but they'll remember what's being passed in social reality, the one simple thing. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the American Indian Wars, and I'll just look at one, Custer's Last Stand. This was a detonator. Here's a quote from Eyewitness History, website here. Outraged over the death of a popular Civil War hero, Custer was a general, like the youngest general, I think, at the time, up to that time, youngest person to make general. He was a famous Civil War hero. So the outrage over the death of the popular Civil War hero on eve of the centennial, right? The nation demanded and received harsh retribution. So we went to the hardcore war against the Indian tribes, the Sioux primarily, Cheyenne also. And so the attack served as a detonator. This is from the University of Chicago website. The image of Custer and his men being overwhelmed by hordes of bloodthirsty Indians reminded Americans that this was a genuine struggle with not only triumphs but also epic losses. All right. One need not feel guilty about the fate of the Indians if they were capable of this kind of carnage. Okay, the massacre of all those men and mutilation of the bodies. So, it's kind of popularly portrayed that Custer was the victim here. They were sacrificed, right? So he was a victim and a martyr and a hero, all right? But to do is I want to teach kind of the background behind this war, all right? Background behind Indian wars. This is going to be an oversimplification, but basically the English settlements in the Americas began at Jamestown, Virginia. All right, that was the first English settlement. Since Jamestown, we've been taking land from the Indians, mostly through war, and we've been waging war against the Indians and making treaties, then breaking the treaty, and waging a war, then making another treaty, breaking that treaty, waging another war, and so forth. And it was a cycle. We're just breaking treaties, making treaties and breaking treaties to wage more war. And we're expanding west, and then a key thing was the Coinage Act of 1873, in which the U.S. currency went on the gold standard, right? And then in 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Right? Black Hills are roughly around there, right? So there was an advantage to the gold standard. Other nations were on the gold standard. Britain kind of led the way with the gold standard. Their pound sterling was on the gold standard, and if you go on the gold standard, you'd have a fixed, reliable exchange rate with other currencies that were on the gold standard, making currency values stable, predictable, and thus facilitating trade. Unpredictability is a big, and risk is a big hindrance to taking economic endeavors. Boosting our economy, but the big economic engine was Western expansion, causing immense economic growth. As a nation, as the economy grew, so would also the money supply become. So also should the money supply, but it didn't. All right, so that's kind of like a background. So I want to put that in, try to make that more understandable. The Gilded Age, with Western expansion, there was a high rate of economic growth, increasing transactions, and increasing demand for money. So as the economy grows, there's more and more transactions, right? And with more and more transactions, there's a higher demand for currency. If money is in short supply, as the economy grows, if the money supply doesn't grow, then there's going to become a scarcity of currency. If there's a scarcity of currency, then the value of the dollar is going to rise, right? With the value of the dollar rises, then that means prices are going to fall. Right, so that's deflationary. Also, with scarcity of money, they would put pressure for higher interest rates. Also, knowing money will go up in value. So this is another problem with deflation. If people know money is going to go up in value, then they'll be more hesitant to spend money. All right, there'll be a tendency to want to save money because they know that money is going to be worth more, as time goes on. So they'll hoard money. Now, if you hoard money and not spend it, that's going to decrease the velocity of money, and that's going to drive down the economy. It'll drive down the GDP, right? So these are all things that will hurt the economy. And now, since the dollar is pegged to gold, and there's a fixed gold supply, there's a fixed money supply, right? So that will limit the growth of the money supply. Now, this hinders economic growth. It hurts businesses. Example is farmers. Okay. I'll put it William Jennings, Brian. Bimetallic. Okay. Let's see here. So I'll give an example of farmers. So farmers were very vocal in wanting to expand the money supply, and they wanted to expand it by including silver-backed currency to have a bimetallic standard. And the example of farmers, they were very affected by deflation. So farmers have the planting season, and they have the reaping season. Now, in the spring when they plant, they have to take out loans in the spring to buy seed. Seed is very expensive. So also is fertilizer. They don't have all this money on hand, so they have to take out loans, right? purchase these, right? And they're paying, interest rates they have to pay are higher due to scarcity of gold money, right? By harvest time, the scarce money has caused deflation, which means prices have dropped, all right? Which means the money has a more value. Plus, they're paying back money which is worth more than the money they borrowed, right? Now, due to low prices for their crops and high interest rates on their loans, farmers can't make a profit and farms fail. So the idea is this. Let me see if I can put this in some more simple words. All right, so farmers have to plant in spring. To plant, they have to buy seeds, right, and fertilizer and so forth, right, and farm equipment. I don't know, they're using, by this time they're using mechanized farming, right? 1830s was the introduction of mechanized farming, so they have to make sure their machines are in shape, and maybe they have to purchase more machines. They have to make investments. They have to take out loans, right? They don't have the money for all this on hand, so they take out loans, and they're paying the interest on these loans, and then half a year later or so, August, September, October, whatever, when they start harvesting their crops, the price they get for their crops has fallen, right? And which means the money has increased in value, right? Right. So they're paying back money, which is more valuable, and they get lower prices for their crops. So they have a hard time meeting, paying back their loans, and it put a lot of pressure on these farmers, and a lot of them went out of business, right? Now this applies to any other business. Let's say you have a startup company that's going to start manufacturing textiles or something like that. They have to build the factory. They have to purchase all the machinery and so forth, right? They have to probably get their own energy source back then, and it takes a lot of investment. Now, after they make that investment, if the money value increases, they're paying back money, which is actually worth a lot more than what they borrowed. Plus, the prices they're getting for the goods is falling, and they have trouble, making payments, and businesses go under. So this was a deflation is a big obstruction to economic growth. Just so also is inflation. Now, other businesses likewise fail. This hurts our economy. Right, so to help our economy, we need to expand the gold supply, to expand the money supply, and this is something that Milton Friedman said in one of the books I read of his. Right, he said, a key problem was the limitation of the gold supply, limiting the money supply. Right, and it wasn't until that led to big push. Just like I said, for William Jennings Bryan was pushing for the bimetallic to get both gold and silver. And I forget all the reasoning, but Milton Friedman outlined a number of problems of that, one of which was you're going to have speculation of currency, right? Especially when you have differential values of silver. Silver value, depending upon, mine discoveries, depending on different policies, whatever. Other nations can have policies that can affect the silver value versus gold value, right? And that can lead to a lot of money being used in speculation, just speculating in currency within our own country instead of being used to, have transactions that drive economic growth and productivity. And Milton Friedman said that a key change was when they developed a new process in extracting gold from ores, a chemical process. All right, gold is very inert, so they had to come up with a chemical process. Gold is inert, so it's non-reactive, and thus they had to come up with a chemical process. I forget what that was. All right, so finally, a strong dollar could affect exchange rates with currencies that are not pegged to gold, right? Overpricing U.S. exports. I haven't read this anywhere. I'm just assuming this, that if we're exchanging with, not all other nations had their currencies pegged to gold, but with the rising value of the dollar, it's pegged to gold. I'm not sure if this really works out. I think it's more of a hypothetical. Maybe I should get rid of this. But if you have a floating exchange rate, for example, and you have a strong dollar, well, that hurts our exports because that outprices U.S. goods. Then in 1874, so we're on the gold standard in 1873. In 1874, gold is discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, deep in Promised Indian territory, right? So we needed to provoke a war with the Indians to take their land, the Black Hills. All right. Now we sent a number of army units deep into Indian territory. Let's see if I got a map here. Yeah. So here's a map, right? Here's Minnesota. Here's North Dakota, South Dakota. Right. This is the key areas. This is the Missouri River. Right. So basically, we pushed the Indians back. Well, I'll cover this when I get to this. So we sent forces deep into Indian territory. All this west of the Missouri is Indian territory, right? Including Custer's force, right? In reality, it was Custer who launched the attack upon the Sioux tribe, camped across the Little Bighorn River. It was a three-pronged attack, similar to the attack he made before, in which he massacred pretty much an entire Indian camp. Custer's 268 men are slaughtered by over 2,000 Indian braves. News of the evil, treacherous Indian massacre is splashed across front pages of the newspaper across the country, and we launched a large campaign against Indians. And I've read accounts of the Indians who survived that winter. They said it was brutal. They had to escape with basically their clothes in their back. They were on the run, being hunted down, and they had to be out in the open, exposed, cold, and it was pretty harsh. Here's a quote. I forget where I got this. Maybe I should try to Google it. Okay, so Inventing Custer. Oh, this is a book. Book here. The Making of American Legend. All right. Okay, his Custer's Last Stand grabbed hundreds of headlines and sold thousands of newspapers, books, and magazines. After Custer's attack and his massacre, the Sioux Indian tribes were hunted down throughout the terrible cold winter. All right, so here's a brief history here. The English landed in Jamestown, right, and pretty much used war to acquire Indian land from the Indians. And then in 1830, we set the Indian removal policy. And really, the Indian removal policy was an effort to find a cheaper means of acquiring Indian land, short of war. War was costly, right? So it was an effort really to try to use legal means to acquire Indian land and moving them off the land. But it still came down to force in the end. You had to force the Indians off. So what this policy said is all Indians would be removed west of the Mississippi. Here's the Mississippi coming down. There's Wisconsin. Here's Illinois, right? And going further down. So the Indians were moved west of here, and that was part of the policy that led to the Trail of Tears, right? Which Cherokee Indians and other Indian groups were pushed into Oklahoma, and 1 out of 4 of the Indians died along the way due to starvation. So that was the Indian removal policy. In 1858, a new treaty pushed Indians further back west of the Missouri River. So now they're being pushed further west, right? But in 1868, they had a treaty of Fort Laramie in which they were guaranteed the Black Hills. So this is where they found gold, though, in 1873 or 1874. So with the coinage act, we went on the gold standard for the dollar. Gold is the base of the money supply, all right? And according to Milton Friedman, the limitation of gold supply was a key force that drove the deflationary period, which was killing farmers and other businesses, right? This led to deflation. I gave you the farming example. Gold discovered in the Black Hills. There's gold discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, so there's a push to take the Black Hills. Here's the Black Hills, and that was kicked off. The battle was kicked off by a detonator. There was a battle of Little Bighorn, and the battle of Little Bighorn went kind of like this. We think of Custer being the victim, all right, who was slaughtered by these savage Indians. Right, but it was actually Custer who launched the attack upon the Indian tribe. It was way out, way out here. So this is Indian territory, and history books will say, well, the reason why they sent these forces is because there were white prospectors of gold being killed by Indians. Well, that's probably true, right? But keep in mind, right, this is Indian territory, promised Indian territory, and white prospectors moving in does not bode well for moving the Indians further back, being pushed further back. So you can see why the white prospectors shouldn't have been there, right? But history books may say, oh, because we did this. So what they did was this attack. They attacked at Little Bighorn here. It was Custer who attacked, and he had like a three-prong attack here. This is the main force, and they were trapped on this hillside and slaughtered. All right. Some of them from Reno's force. I think Reno was either a captain or a lieutenant. They escaped, right? But no one from this force over here escaped. All right. So Custer's plan of attack. Here's Custer's words: Indians contemplating battle, either offensive or defensive, are all anxious to have their women and children removed from all danger. For this reason, I decided to locate our military camp as close as convenient to Chief Black Kettle's Cheyenne village, knowing that the close proximity of the women and children and the necessary exposure in case of conflict would operate as a powerful argument in favor of peace. And when the question of peace or war came, we discussed using these women and children as leverage. This is one of Custer's officers. Who is this? Lieutenant Edward Joffrey. The probable attack upon the families and capture of herds were in that event counted upon to strike consternation in the hearts of the warriors, just like it is up here, and were elements of success upon which General Custer fully counted. All right. So here's kind of a summary. Let's see here. Let me show you this picture here. So this is Treaty of 1868, right? 1868. Treaty of Fort Laramie, the guarantee to Black Hills, all right? And then after the whole battle, we made this Indian reservation, I guess. So they kept this territory, but we took the Black Hills. The U.S. took the Black Hills here. It shows, it points toward motive, right? And then in 1889, we took further territory from them. And I read a little bit about this. This is about acquiring the best lands, but also I'm sure this is about transportation through this territory. I know Route I-90 goes through this territory. So we took more of the Indian land away. Okay. So this map shows growth of the U.S. economy required growth in the money supply. This required growth in gold reserves since the dollar was pegged to gold. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota here, right? So we attacked Indians deep in promised Indian territory. This is the boundary of Indian territory. Everything west here was promised to them according to treaty. And Custer made his attack way out here. This is where the gold was. This is the boundary. Went way over here to attack them over here. And then we take the Black Hills and leave them. And then we took the Black Hills and we left them land to the east here. Okay, so this territory we left them. Reservations, here's Cheyenne Reservation. This is Pine Ridge Reservation. So Rosebud Reservation. So Rosebud is maybe this area over here. This is the territory we took for them. For the territory. Oh yeah, Route 90 goes through there. Look at that. Route 90 goes right through that. So I was right. Route 90 goes right through there. Key transportation hub. Okay. So Mexican-American War. This will be the last war we'll talk about here. All right. Detonator was on April 25th. Mexican forces crossed the Rio Grande River and engaged an American force. 11 U.S. soldiers were killed. News reached Washington 8 days later. President Polk went before Congress and stated, "American blood has been spilt on American soil." Right? I know Abraham Lincoln said, "American blood's been spilt on what American soil?" or something like that. He questioned that, right? we'll see the background behind this in a second here. This rally is a great patriotic cry, and men flock to join the army in the fight against the war against Mexico. Right. So here's the background. These maps show the progression of territory transition away from Mexico, right, to the United States. So all this territory here in the Southwest was Mexican territory. All right. Now Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821. Right. So they became an independent nation, independent from Spain. All right. Now U.S. citizens were flooding into Mexican territory, into the Texas territory, and they were refusing to pay Mexican taxes. They were also violating Mexican law, bringing in slaves, and so slavery was against the law in Mexico. They were bringing in slaves, and they were also violating immigration restrictions. They were swarming in, and all of this was a threat to Mexican sovereignty in the territory. You can't allow all this. You can't allow, not paying taxes or abiding by the law, right, or flooding in, because that threatens Mexican control of that territory, right? It threatens their sovereignty in that territory. So now the president of Mexico, General Santa Anna, tried to crack down and enforce Mexican laws. The Americans revolted and declared independence in 1836. They fought a short war, with remember the Alamo. Remember the Alamo. Also remember Goliath as detonators. They won independence and established Republic of Texas. This is the Republic of Texas. And then what happened was General Santa Anna was captured in this fight, and he was accused of massacres at both the Alamo and Goliath because he carried out summary executions of all those people who were captured, and under the threat of his life, he was forced to sign over the rest of Texas. So the rest of the Texas territory is this maroon area here, up to the Rio Grande. So this is the Nueces River, I believe, and this is the Rio Grande here, and all this other territory. He signed it over, but upon signing it away, he was released, but then he immediately renounced the document as illegal because it was coerced under threat of his life, right? And I've read history books, anyways. I haven't done the original document searches here, but I read history books in which, they say that I've read that they held a Bowie knife to his throat. Okay, so, and then we'll see President Grant's statement below. President Grant also could, attest to this below here. Now, I want to give an analogy. Let's say I break into someone's house late at night, and I put a knife to the throat of a person laying in bed, and I have a pad of paper and a pen, and I say, sign over, right, with a knife at his throat, sign over, the deed to your house, sign over your house to me, right? Now, after I get him to sign it over, what court of law in the United States is going to recognize that as being legal? All right, so right now we wanted California, so that happened before. Now we wanted to go further. A key thing was California ports, right, to expand trade with Asia. We wanted California, and we offered to purchase it from Mexico for $25 million, but Mexico was not interested. President Polk is elected in 1844 on an expansionist platform, right? He promises to expand the country, and the two key places to expand were the Southwest Territories here and also the Northwest. This is all acquired already in the Louisiana Purchase, this funnel shape here, right? That was acquired from France in 1803. 1803. So Polk got us this, and he got us this. This was the Oregon Treaty of 1846. President Polk acquired that, right? Made the agreement. I guess that's what the 49th parallel there. He set the boundary. So we acquired this territory, the Oregon Territory, and then he acquired the Southwest Territory, finishing off the continental United States. So he was elected on an expansionist platform, and he expanded. Right. So Now, we had already taken 1/3 of Texas from Mexico, so that was about 1/3 of Texas we'd taken already in 1836. Um, in March of 1846, Polk orders a force of 5,000 soldiers under Zachary Taylor to march deep into the Mexican territory. Right, this is Mexican territory. Even though it's called the disputed territory, any reasonable, honest, fair, logical person would say, no, that's Mexican territory. Mexicans populated it, right? It was acquired under force of duress, right? And then they marched deep into Mexican territory and established fortifications across from the Mexican force garrisoned at Matamoros. It's a city near the Rio Grande. There's Matamoros is right there, okay, just across the Rio Grande, all right? Okay, now Taylor constructed, so once he got down there, he constructed artillery fortifications pointing at the Mexican forces, but this was unable to provoke a reaction, an incident. Then Taylor ordered the naval blockade of the mouth of the Rio Grande that cut off the source of supply for the Mexican army, which was stationed at Matamoros. All right. So again, we said that naval blockade is a classic act of war, cutting off commerce. Commerce is the lifeblood of a nation. In this case, commerce is the means of supporting provisions for that Mexican force. I think they had a force of around 10,000 over there. All right, now shortly thereafter, a Mexican force crossed the Rio Grande and engaged in U.S. forces. 11 Americans were killed. All right, news of the incident was rushed to Washington, and President Polk says to Congress, American blood has been spilt on American soil. There arose a great patriotic outcry, and we went to war with Mexico, and we took from Mexico what is today the southwest United States. So all this territory, which includes California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, a portion of Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, right, Texas. Right? All of this was taken from Mexico in that war. And it was kicked off by provocation, which we sent the force to provoke an incident, and sure enough, we took an act of war blockading, and sure enough, an incident was provoked, and we used that as a detonator to justify the war against Mexico. And from that, we took all this territory. Now, about the war, President Grant said this. This is from his memoirs. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure. So General Grant, President Grant, was a junior officer in Zachary Taylor's force that went down here. So he was involved in that force. He said this, for myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war with Mexico, which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies and not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. These colonists paid very little attention to the supreme government and, so he's talking about the whole Texas revolt there in 1836. So he's talking about the colonists who flooded into Mexican territory, right? These colonists paid very little attention to the supreme government and introduced slavery into the state almost from the start, though the Constitution of Mexico did not, nor does it now, sanction that institution. Soon they set up independent government of their own, and so they set up an independent government of their own, and then war existed between Texas and Mexico in name from that time until 1836, when they defeated the Mexican forces, and they established the Republic of Texas, which was an independent territory, not yet inducted not getting statehood as of yet, but it was a slave territory. So this is what he further says. When active hostilities very nearly ceased upon the capture of Santa Anna, the Mexican president, Santa Anna was a general, but he was also Mexican president. Before long, however, the same people who, with permission of Mexico, had colonized Texas and afterwards set up slavery there, and then seceded as soon as they felt strong enough to do so, right, offered themselves and the state to the United States And in 1845, their offer was accepted. So that's when they got statehood, I guess. Right? The occupation, separation, and annexation were, from the inception of the movement to its final consummation, a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union. Okay, so here's the context of that. I'll try to explain that to you. Best explain with this. So, this is the Louisiana Purchase, right? Now, according to the 1820 Missouri Compromise, slavery would not be admitted north of the southern border of Missouri. Here's the southern border of Missouri, right? So that includes Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, as far as the Louisiana Purchase, right? The vast majority, the lion's share, would have no slavery, right? And all these territories were potential statehood. So this would shift the political balance in favor of the North, right? So this was a huge implement to Southern political power, right? So what Grant is saying that the reason why this was a conspiracy to expand territory, more statehood means more politicians, right, for slavery, right? That's what Grant says, according to Grant, anyways. And it kind of makes sense. They want to expand Southern territory. The lion's share of territories in possession of the United States, which did not have statehood as yet, right, would be in the North, right? This portion of the Louisiana Purchase, right? And all these territories wanted to go free, right? Not because they had any favoritism towards black people, but because of the economics of it. I talked about that in my discussion of the Civil War, right? California wanted to be free too, even though it's in the southern area here, right? All right, so even if the annexation itself could be justified, the manner in which the subsequent war was forced upon Mexico cannot. The fact is, annexationists wanted more territory than they could possibly lay any claim to as part of the new acquisition. Texas, as an independent state, never exercised jurisdiction over the territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, right? That's a disputed territory. Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas and maintained that, even if independent, the state had no claim south of the Nueces, right? So here would be the Nueces River, right? I'm aware that a treaty made by the Texans with Santa Anna while he was under duress ceded all territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. But he was a prisoner of war when the treaty was made, and his life was in jeopardy. I told you that history books say that he was threatened with bowie knives. He knew, too, that he deserved execution at the hands of the Texans if they should ever capture him. Well, this is debatable. If the Texans, if they had taken his life, would have only followed the example set by Santa Anna himself a few years before, when he executed the entire garrison of the Alamo and the villagers of Goliad. All right, so there was a couple hundred, I think, U.S. soldiers at this Goliad thing too. Anyways, so General Santa Anna had summary execution of all the people who were captured at Alamo. No one survived, and then Goliad. All right. So is that legal? Well, in our nation, in the United States, if you have try to overthrow the United States, you can be executed, right? And here's an example of self-serving bias. Now, by law, it was lawful for General Santa Anna to execute all those people who tried to overthrow the Mexican government, right, to gain independence. So here's an example of self-serving bias. Now, after the Mexican-American War, Americans moved in and seized land from the Mexicans. They just kicked them off, right? This is our land now, right? Who then revolted, and then they opposed, they resisted. So they were hunted down, captured, tried, and then hung as seditionists, right? So now, when they revolted, we executed them, right? But probably in American minds, well, that's law, right? But if Americans revolted, tried to overthrow the government, they were martyrs, and it was a legal killing. So it's just an example how you can bias the way you see things based upon your interests and perspective. Um, all right, so I don't think Santa Anna's just carrying out the law here. Um, the Army did not stop at the Nueces and offer to negotiate for a settlement of the boundary question, but went beyond, apparently in order to force Mexico to initiate war. So that's what General President Grant says, that the whole purpose of this was to provoke a war, and it did. Right, killing 11 Americans was enough to get the war. Now, General Taylor, Zachary Taylor's second in command, was Colonel Hitchcock. He wrote this in his diary. I have said from the first that the United States are the aggressors. We have not a particle of right to be here. It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war so as to have a pretext for taking California and as much of this territory as it chooses. For whatever becomes of this army, there is no doubt of a war between the United States and Mexico. My heart is not in this business, but as a military man, I am bound to execute orders. Right? So he's saying that we're trying to provoke a war to take as much territory as we want, and we did. As soon as we got this war, we took all the southwest chunk. All right. Okay. So that's detonators. Where would they attack? They would have probably attacked First Gulf War and Spanish-American War. Now, I openly state that the Spanish-American War, you cannot prove who did it. But all indications are we carried out a plan to expand the economy into Asia at a time when it was necessary.